Impossible Love. Copyright 2015 Samantha Price. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. Judge not, and ye shall not be judged. Condemn not, and ye shall not be condemned. Forgive, and ye shall be forgiven. Luke chapter 6 verse 37. Verity Fisher glanced up at the clock on the wall of her family's restaurant. Around 2 more hours to go, she told herself as she gradually cleared the unoccupied tables. When the service bell rang, Verity looked up to see Lily pointing to 2 coffees she had just made. She knew the coffees were for table 3, where the last 2 people in the restaurant were sitting. It had been one of the busiest days that the restaurant had ever had. A slower pace replaced the usual spring in Verity's step. All she could think of was going home. "I hope that's all they have," Lily whispered to Verity. "Surely they can see that we want to close?" Verity glanced at the 2 men who were engrossed in a conversation. It seemed they were totally oblivious to the late hour. She nodded in agreement to her friend Lily, knowing that even when they closed the doors on the last customer of the night, they'd have another 2 hours in which to clean the kitchen and the restaurant in readiness for the next day. Verity had always worked the late shift, since her parents and younger sister preferred to start early and finish early. Her 2 older sisters worked in the restaurant as well, but only part-time, as they were both married with families. After Verity placed the coffees in front of the last 2 patrons, she saw Lily flounce across to the front doors and shut them. Lily turned to the gentleman customers and with a saccharine smile said, "Take your time, we are closed now, but please finish your coffees." The 2 men smiled appreciatively at the young, attractive Amish woman who was so gracious and polite. It appeared that no one was immune to Lily's charms. How does she do that? How can she approach strangers and speak to them with such confidence? Verity thought, as she admired Lily's outgoing, friendly personality. 5 minutes later the men had paid for their meal and left, leaving a sizable tip. "See, that's all you have to do. Be polite and flash a big smile." Lily stuffed the note in the tip jar behind the counter. "You'll have to give me some lessons." Verity sucked at her bottom lip while she wiped down the front counter. "I should give you some lessons. Don't be so timid all the time. You're a beautiful, attractive woman." Lily began her arduous nightly task of pulling the coffee machine apart to clean it. "Lily is funny. She calls me beautiful when I'm an old woman of 28, old and weary beyond my years. Yeah, I'm a woman. I'm no longer a girl." Lily picked up a jagged silver thing which was part of the coffee machine and pointed it toward Verity. "Just be more confident and people will respond to you. You're so funny and good to be around, but you don't show that to people. You're always so quiet, like you're trying to hide or something." Comes with the territory of being a middle child, Verity thought. It's easy to be invisible being the middle child of 5 girls. Verity's younger sister, Ruth, was going to be married this coming wedding season. Verity was to have gotten married many wedding seasons ago, during the same wedding season that her older sister, Beth, had gotten married. "If I'd got married when I was supposed to, I would have 3 children by now as well, just like Beth." When Lily had finished cleaning all the pieces of the coffee machine, she began putting it back together. "So are you still stuck on Reuben?" At the mention of his name, Verity's fingernails dug into the cleaning cloth that she was holding. "It's just that he never contacted me once, not even to tell me why he wasn't coming back. I've never heard anything from him." The hollow feeling in her heart opened once more. "Why did I have to fall in love with Reuben, the only man I know who left the community after he was betrothed? What is so horrible about me that caused him to run away, never to come back? He lied to me. I believed him when he said he would return. If we had married, right now I'd have already gotten the children into bed, I'd have finished cleaning the kitchen, and I'd be reading quietly on a couch right next to Reuben." Verity rubbed her eyes. "I don't know that I could ever trust a man again. I know God says to forgive people, but I haven't been able to forgive Reuben." Lily interrupted Verity's thoughts by saying, "I've never been in love, so I don't know how it feels. It must be hard, but you have to forget him and look for someone else." Lily filled up the mop bucket with hot water. "Just try, Verity. How are you going to get a husband if you don't talk to anyone?" Verity made a start of putting all the chairs up on the tables in readiness for the floor washing. "I gave up on that a long time ago. I'm way too old to get married now. Nonsense. There'll be someone somewhere for you for sure and for certain. Lily popped a dollop of cleaning fluid in the hot water, and with the back of her hand, wiped the little beads of sweat that were forming on her brow. I'd rather not talk about it, Lily. It's all right for you, you're young, Verity thought. I am too old. The only single men are 22 or old widowers who are about 90. The young men don't want an old thing like me, and I don't want to be looking after some old man who's old enough to be my grandfather. Lily laughed as she pushed the heavy mop along the polished wooden floor of the restaurant. Someone will come along for you, just wait and see. God will bring you someone good. Just wait. Verity had already spent too long waiting on one man, and what a complete and total disaster that was. She had no desire to listen to her friends speak of men and marriage. She had resigned herself to her life as it was at this moment. Anyway, she still had love in her life, love of her family and her friends. It was the love of a man that she knew she would never have again. Almost 2 hours later, the restaurant was sparkling clean. With only a few dishes left to dry, Verity told Lily to go home as she would finish the rest. Once Verity had finished the dishes, she stood at the door and looked out into the loneliness of the night. There was peace in loneliness, and now it had become an old friend. The shadowy road was deserted, apart from dry leaves swept along the road by the breeze. The trees behind one of the buildings opposite swayed under a gust of wind. Instinctively, she raised her hands to tie her prayer cap on tightly, and then pulled her heavy black coat around her, ready for the 1-mile walk to her family home. Verity was grateful to have a loving family, but she would rather not live the rest of her days in her parents' house. A family of her own was something she desired above all else. Once Ruth married and left, that would leave only herself and Faith at home with their dad, mom, and grandmother. As she walked the isolated road home, she wondered how her life would have been different if Reuben had not gone out into the English world, something that she had wondered far too often. Stop it. You'll no longer think of him, she reprimanded herself. This man did not even deserve a minute of her thoughts, not after what he had done. Verity had prayed many times for God to take the anger and bitterness over this man from her heart, but her feelings had fermented into bitter hatred. The only way for her to continue was to be fueled by her hatred of Reuben. She had been comforted by her visit to the bishop when she told him of her feelings of hate and bitterness before she was baptized. The bishop told her that if she confessed her feelings to God, then he would forgive her even if she had to confess 6 times a day. She pulled her thick black coat even tighter around her as the wind whistled straight through all her layers. She knew her nose and lips were numb, but she wasn't going to touch them and make her hands even colder. Her hands tightly interlocked under the sleeves, hiding from the cold. As her house came into view, she felt the tension of the day and the tension of her thoughts of Reuben leave her. As usual, she arrived home to the house in semi-darkness, with the warm glow of a lone gas lamp left on in the main room for her late arrival. The warmth of the house met her cold cheeks, and after a few minutes in front of the wood heater, her whole body felt cozy and comforted. Verity put the kettle on the stove to fix herself a nice hot peppermint tea. Every night after work, she had the same routine. She would sit in the darkness of the kitchen, warming her hands on the hot mug, while telling herself that this was the life she was meant to live. She should be grateful to have such a loving family, and to live in such a joyful house. Chapter 2. Forbearing one another, and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. Colossians chapter 3 verse 13. Verity considered that an advantage of doing the night shift was that grandmother fixed her a good hot meal every morning. Her normal waking up time was around 11, and by that time her mom, dad, and younger sister Faith would all be working at the restaurant. Her other younger sister, Ruth, did not want to work at the restaurant and preferred to stay home and help grandmother work in the house. Ruth did all cleaning and the gardening, and helped grandmother with the cooking. The family had fitted all their chores and other commitments around work in the restaurant that they'd owned for 12 years. For generations, Verity's family had been farmers, but the income from the farm hadn't been enough to support their large family of all girls. Verity's father had often said if he'd had boys instead of girls, they would never have needed to move away from farming. When he opened the small restaurant, it had only been to supplement their income, yet from there it had grown to become their sole source of income. A shaft of bright sunlight streamed in through Verity's bedroom window and fell on her closed eyelids. She had learned long ago that it did not pay to be idle and linger in bed. Thoughts of Reuben and how he had ruined her life were never far from her mind. It was best to keep busy and get out of bed quickly. This particular morning she was pleasantly lured to the kitchen by the smell of freshly baked bread. Verity's grandmother looked up when she entered the kitchen. "You're a little early this morning, aren't ya?" Verity's grandmother wiped some flour off her kindly chubby face with the back of her hand. She was a short, stout lady who had a generous heart. She had lived in that same house since she married some 60 years ago. Verity's grandfather died 5 years ago, and now Verity's grandmother lived in an addition which her father had added onto the family's large home. Verity took her place at the well-worn wooden table in the kitchen, just as she did every morning. "Not sure what time it is, the sun woke me." Verity yawned with her mouth open widely, only covering her mouth at the last minute with her hand. "That bread smells delicious." "You're just in time. I've only finished baking it." Grandmother placed the fourth large loaf of bread on the cooling rack next to the others. Verity took in a deep breath. Nothing smells nicer than baked bread. "Your usual eggs with coffee first?" Verity stood up and walked over to inspect the bread. "Yeah, please." She cut herself 2 slices of the hot bread and spread lashings of fresh butter over the top. Verity looked up to see Ruth, her sister, coming through the back door with an empty wicker washing basket under her arm. Ruth was always bright and happy, and now even more so with her wedding fast approaching. "You must be hungry," Ruth said. "Not more than usual. I just love fresh baked bread. Grandmother never usually makes the bread this early in the day, so I never have a chance to taste it when it's warm like this." Life was pretty much the same every day for Verity. Nothing ever changed in her life. It was as if she was living the same day over and over again. However, she had a feeling that this day would not be the same as every other day, and it would not be just because her grandmother had made bread earlier in the day than usual. While she waited for her eggs, Verity walked out the back door to her herb garden with her basket in hand. Verity grew the herbs for the restaurant. Before the restaurant had grown too big, she grew all the vegetables for it as well. Now her garden kept only the family in vegetables, but both the restaurant and the family were kept in Verity's herbs. Every week Shane, the head chef, gave Verity a list of herbs he needed for the week ahead. This week his list included mint, fennel, sage, thyme, rosemary, and chamomile. She picked sizable quantities of each and placed them in a basket. She sprinkled a little water over them to keep them fresh, and covered them with a clean dish towel. Verity gazed fondly at the neat rows of herbs. If she did not work at the restaurant, she was sure she would spend all her time digging about the garden. She loved the satisfaction of watching things grow from seeds. Ruth looked after the colorful flowers at the front of the house, but Verity preferred to tend the herbs and the vegetables. She sat her basket of herbs on the kitchen table, and considered going to work a little earlier than she was due, but first her eggs waited for her. As she watched her grandmother busily flitting across the kitchen, tending to the cleanup after baking the bread, Verity realized that it must be very hard for her grandmother to be without grandfather. It would be hard to wake up every morning for 50 years next to a man, then suddenly he's gone and you realize you are by yourself. Grandmother never spoke of her pain, just as Verity never spoke to the family of her pain. A wretched thought popped into Verity's head. Would she feel better if Reuben had died? If he had died instead of leaving her and never coming back, she would still feel abandoned, but he would have had no choice. She shook her head briskly. "Stop thinking silly thoughts, Verity." Still, she had a connection to grandmother, as they both without the men that they loved. Except for the fact that grandfather had loved grandmother in return, and would never have abandoned her. Once Verity had finished breakfast, she did a few chores, before she began the mile walk to the restaurant. The wind was chilly, but the sun warmed her face as she walked down the quiet tree-lined driveway to the road. The sounds of birds chirping put a smile on her face. All different types of birds were making noises. They have so much to say today, she thought. Maybe they were that noisy every day, she had never noticed them before. As she walked in the back door to the restaurant, Faith, her youngest sister, came bounding toward her. He's here, he's here." Verity studied Faith's untidy appearance. Her apron was soiled from working in the kitchen, her face was flushed, and blonde tendrils of hair were escaping her prayer cap. Who's here? Either Faith has a boy she's interested in, or there's an important person in the restaurant. Reuben's here. You're Reuben. Chapter 3. But I say unto you which hear. Love your enemies. Do good to them which hate you. Luke chapter 6 verse 27. All strength drained from Verity's body. She leaned against the rough red bricks that made up the outer walls of the restaurant. Had he come to see her after all this time? He must know things are over between us. What could he mean by coming back here after all this time? How dare he show his face in this restaurant or anywhere near any of my family? Verity steeled herself to speak to him. They had never had a proper conversation to end their relationship. She had to tell him what she thought of him. Where is he? He's not here right now. He left. That would be typical of him, to show up and just to leave again. Verity clutched her sister's arm. Faith, what did he say? Faith's vivid blue eyes shot to the sky as she recalled all that he'd said. He seemed angry. He asked for you and I said that you don't start working for a while yet, and he said that he'd be back later. Angry. Verity released her grip on Faith's arm. Thank you, now you should get back to work. Faith went back to her kitchen duties, while Verity walked up and down behind the restaurant. Her hand held her throbbing head. Why would he be angry? How dare he be angry? I should be the only one who is angry. Verity looked at the old building positioned behind the restaurant. It lay desolate and empty. Her parents had purchased the building that adjoined their restaurant after Reuben had promised to renovate it into a B&B, which he and Verity planned to run after they got married. How could he show his face after he ran out on my parents and me? He left Mom and Dad with a huge barn of a building with no money for renovation. After Reuben had run off, Verity urged her father to take a bank loan to enable renovations to be done. His response was that he would not borrow money. He said that borrowing money from the English would make him unequally yoked with unbelievers, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 14. She reached into the basket of herbs for her bundle of keys that lay underneath them. She was more than sure she had a key that would unlock the old rustic wooden door. The largest key looked the obvious choice. With unsteady hands she turned the key in the lock and with a loud click the door opened easily. A gust of stale air engulfed her as she stood in the doorway and surveyed the dusty interior. Seeing the dust-covered tools that lay scattered on the floor reminded her that Reuben had worked a day on the old building before he left. Verity coughed and tried to ignore the dust that caught in the back of her throat. At one point this place had been her future, hers and Reuben's. If only Reuben hadn't gone to New York trying to make instant money, rather than build a stable future together. As long as they had enough money to get by, that's all Verity would have cared about. But Reuben was not content with the plan of living with her parents in their house, until they built up a deposit for their own house. Why, we could have even lived here, Verity said as she turned in a complete circle. Reuben refused to take what he saw as a handout. He said that he wanted to work and create his own money. The back of Verity's eyes stung as a sign that tears threatened to escape. She took a deep breath and forced herself to be brave. The anger in Verity's heart squashed any tears over what might have been as she recalled how he'd left her. An English friend of Reuben's had lured him to New York with the promise of making big money in a short space of time. The 6 months he'd said he'd be gone for had turned into 6 years. Today was the first time Verity had heard of him returning to his home in Lancaster County. Here you are. Verity spun around on hearing the deep voice she knew belonged to her father. Her father nearly filled the doorway as he stood with feet spread out and hands on his hips. Faith told you he's back? Verity's eyes fell to the floor with embarrassment. She was partly responsible for the debt of this old building. Yeah, did you see him? No, I've just come back from the markets. Her father stepped into the room that was to have been their reception area. Why do you think he's come back after all this time? Verity took a small step back and bit her bottom lip. Wonders me that he's come back at all after what he did to you. His lips pressed tightly together and the lines between his eyes turned into deep unsightly furrows. Dad, I'm not worried about me. Look at this place. Verity turned her head to look at the empty space that so greatly needed love and attention. Her father raised both hands in front of him, palms facing Verity. We'll get the money eventually, and then we'll turn this place into a B&B, but I'll have no talk again of borrowing money." A small giggle escaped Verity's lips. "All right, Dad." The truth was, Verity had already given up on trying to make her father see sense about borrowing money from an English bank. She had even paid an accountant to work out projected earnings, and presented her father on paper, with exactly how they could pay the bank back in a reasonable period. All her efforts were in vain, and the building, still full of potential, lay empty and dust-filled. The responsibility of the empty building weighed heavily on Verity's shoulders. She was sure she would not feel any happiness in her heart until this building was a working B&B. As far as Verity was concerned, this old historic building, if turned into a B&B, would be a roaring success. It was in a perfect part of town, and there were always so many tourists. Verity knew once it opened, it could not fail. "If I had seen him, I would have told him to go. If he comes back, I will tell him to never come near any of our family again." Her father walked toward the door. Verity could see how upset he was by the way he ground his teeth as he spoke. "Don't upset yourself. I'll tell him to go." Once he stepped through the door, he turned back to Verity and said, "He cast a dark shadow over your life, Verity. You paid no mind to other men who came calling on you, thinking he was coming back. Now you're a spinster with not much hope of a husband." Tears were tingling in Verity's eyes again, but she blinked them back. She would not cry over her situation anymore. She would make the best of her life. Her father's words hurt, but he was just speaking the truth that lay plain and simple in front of her face. "I can't hold bitterness in my heart, and neither can you." "I know, Dad, I know." A tear escaped her eye, but she did not want to call attention to it by wiping it away. She let it fall softly down her cheek. Her father leaned toward her. "Do you want to go home? We most likely can do without you today." "No, Dad, I'll be fine. I'll be there soon. I just want to be by myself for a little while, if that's all right. Give me 10 minutes. Can you take the basket of herbs by the door to the kitchen?" Her father smiled and walked back to the restaurant, leaving her alone. Verity knew that going home, and being alone with her tormenting thoughts, would be the worst thing for her. Keeping busy in the restaurant, and the strength that God gave her, were the things she needed. Verity had heard a few things about Reuben over the past few years. She heard he had earned millions of dollars by partnering with someone who had developed some payment system over the internet. Verity didn't really understand it, nor did she care to understand what he did. All she knew was that his millions had bought him a very expensive English lifestyle, a lifestyle that had drawn him away from everything he should have held onto. When he dies and comes face to face with God, what good will his millions do him then? Verity recalled the scripture that hung in her grandmother's living room, "For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" Verity took another look around the room, and then locked the door behind her. She knew one day she would face the man who deserted her. Then she would put the whole disappointment behind her. As soon as Verity pulled the key from the lock, she turned to see a very different Reuben striding toward her. His body was wider, stronger, his dark hair was cropped short against his head, and his clothes were English business clothes. Reuben's long, muscular legs closed the distance between them. Verity noticed that he walked with purpose while she was rooted to the spot. Chapter 4. Confess your faults one to another, and pray one for another, that ye may be healed. The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. James chapter 5 verse 16. There you are. Verity could not speak, but just looked up into his brown eyes. The kindly brown eyes that had once looked at her with love were now looking at her as if she were detestable. As she stared up at his manly frame, she realized she had failed in her efforts to scrub out the memory of this man. She remembered too well the darkness of those eyes, the ruggedness of his tanned features, and even the subtle contour of his lips that she had longed so very much to kiss. He cast his eyes up and down the length of her body. "Well, don't you have anything to say?" The sound of his deep voice caused her heart to skip a beat. Verity sternly reminded herself of what this man had done to her. "What do you want?" She spat her words out. Verity did not care how rude she sounded, and the way her stomach had clenched, she was surprised she could speak at all. He crossed his arms in front of his solid chest and planted his feet in a wide stance. "I want to know why you were so immature as to send a letter telling me my mom was in the hospital." Verity gasped. Your mom's in the hospital? Verity had always been fond of Reuben's mom, but in the last few years she'd had to stay away from her, as the memories of Reuben were far too painful. No, she is not. You know very well she is not in the hospital. You sent me a letter saying she was, just to get me to come back to you. Verity's mouth fell open in shock at his cruel words. But what else would she expect from one so cruel as to not contact her for 6 whole years since they'd been betrothed? He continued, Did you think I'd stay and marry you once I came and saw you again? I've never heard of anyone play such a childish trick on someone. How dare he come here and accuse me of something I would never do? Verity thought. That's all he has to say to me after so much time has passed? No apology for lying to me and having me waiting for him for so long. I did no such thing. New York has turned you mad, quite mad. Reuben shifted his weight from one expensive black shoe to the other. Oh, come on. The letter was postmarked Lancaster County. It would be if it were a letter about your mother, wouldn't it? Well, it wasn't me. I would never do such a terrible thing. This was not the reunion for which she might have hoped. She'd had visions of him asking for forgiveness and offering excuses, but he was doing none of those things. Reuben loosened the top button of his highly starched, white-collared shirt. It's obvious to me that you hatched a plot to get me back here. Who else would send such a letter, and what would their purpose be? Verity screwed up her face, not caring how unappealing she looked to him. Why would I want you to come back? It's easy to see you don't care about me, or you would have come back well before now. You haven't married, have you? Verity's nervous fingers fiddled with her prayer cap. No, thanks to you. I waited for your return and ignored all the men who wanted me, and now they're married. Verity wanted him to know exactly how horribly he had treated her, and the pain that she had endured because of him. Reuben laughed. His laugh was cruel and mocking. So that's my fault? Yeah, of course it's your fault. You are a sinner and a liar. Now go away with your fancy tales of some letter. Verity turned and hurried to the back door of the restaurant. As she put her hand on the door handle, she heard Reuben yell. The liar is you. You lied about my mom. You thought you could get me back here and I'd marry you? You Amish girls are all the same, you just want to get married. Verity opened the door and closed it loudly behind her. She was glad that she had seen Reuben again, because now she knew that he was not the same Reuben she had fallen in love with. Years of living the English lifestyle had turned him into a different person, a person that she no longer cared for. He may have even gone mad, just like she had said to him. The Reuben she had fallen in love with was gentle, thoughtful, and loving. Flashbacks of when they were courting ran through Verity's mind. They would walk together in the fields for hours, hand in hand, while they dreamed up names for all the children they would have. They decided to have at least 3 boys and 3 girls. Verity had admired him because he was a hard-working man, but that hard-working drive had driven him right out of the community into a world that led him off God's path. Are you all right, Verity? Verity focused her attention on Shane, the young English chef in front of her. She realized she was leaning against the door in a daze. Yeah, I'm okay, thank you, Shane. Verity had often thought that Shane was keen on her, but she would never get romantically involved with an Englisher, no matter how good-looking he was, and no matter how nice he appeared to be. Shane was the chef who ran the kitchen. He had worked for the family for just over a year. Verity pulled her white apron over her head and tied it behind her waist before heading into the restaurant to start her shift. Lily was already in her usual spot, making the coffees and the drinks. Table 2 needs their order taken. Lily nodded her head toward the table, then moved closer to Verity. Was that your Reuben who was in here earlier? Yeah, but he's not my Reuben. He's nothing more than a stranger. Verity hissed her words. Lily had become a good friend to Verity ever since they started working the same shift at the restaurant. Even though Lily was Amish and had grown up in the same community, she would have been too young to know Reuben before he left for New York. It was 6 o'clock that evening when Verity's father tapped her on the shoulder. Verity, I'm going home now, but I've asked Shane to stay until closing tonight. He raised his eyebrows before saying, just in case there is an unwelcome visitor. Verity knew that he meant Reuben when he spoke of the unwelcome visitor. Thank you, that makes me feel a lot better. Shane normally left after the mains were cooked and served, leaving the second chef in charge to finish up the night. As well as being handsome, Shane would make her a suitable bodyguard against unwanted visitors. The rest of the night, Verity hoped that Reuben would not come back to harass her. Verity was grateful that Lily did not mention Reuben again. Maybe someone has asked her not to mention him to me, she thought. Verity's thoughts turned to Reuben's conversation about a letter. Why would he accuse her of such a thing? She could not think of who would do such a thing, and was disappointed that he would think she had sent it. It was loud and clear to Verity that Reuben thought her a sad spinster who was desperate enough to send a letter of lies about his mom. He showed he thought little of the Amish way of life by the way he had spoken of Amish women. Verity had to admit that his words were partly true. She wanted more than anything to get married. Was it so terrible to want to be married? Isn't it good to want to take loving care of a husband, a home, and have a family? Reuben thinks poorly of marriage, as if it is a detestable thing. How he's changed from the man he once was. I'll help you girls with the cleanup and then I'll drive you home, Verity. No, Shane, I've already kept you long enough. Thank you for staying on. If Reuben knocks on the door, we just won't open it and I'll be all right walking home. It's not as if he's a criminal or anything. Dad tends to be overly protective. Verity liked to walk home in the dark by herself. It was her own quiet time, and in a funny way she felt close to God as she walked home every night in the dark. Your father asked me to stay until closing time and then I'll drive you home. Shane stood in front of Verity and smiled down at her, showing his handsome white teeth. You don't want me to get into trouble with the boss, do you? I guess not. Thank you. Besides, with me helping clean up, we'll be out of here in no time flat. Verity noticed that a beaming smile crossed Lily's face when Shane had mentioned getting out early. Chapter 5. But if ye forgive not men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. Matthew chapter 6 verse 15. So what's the story with this man? What's his name, Reuben? Verity was too tired to think straight, let alone have the energy to speak of Reuben, but Shane had been good enough to stay longer at work. He was also good enough to be driving her home in his pickup truck. It's a very long story. To put it all into a nutshell, I was to marry him. He went to New York, where he said he could get a lot of money fast for a deposit for a home, and he never came back until today. So how long has he been gone? Shane gave a sideways glance toward Verity. 6 years. Yeah, 6 years, 2 months and 3 days to be exact, Verity thought. That's awful. Although Verity's eyes were fixed on the road ahead, she could see Shane jerk his head in an agitated manner. Verity remained silent for a moment. However, pangs of guilt over the old building her parents had purchased caused her to add, You know the old building behind the restaurant? Yes. My mother and father bought that because Reuben was to renovate it into a B&B, and then we were going to run it as husband and wife. Shane threw his head back. That's awful. I'm so sorry, Verity. It wasn't long before the car pulled up at the house. Thanks so much for driving me home. Just as Verity shut the truck door, Shane said, That Reuben guy doesn't know what he's let slip through his fingers. Verity gave a tiny laugh, and wasn't sure if Shane was referring to Reuben missing out on a good woman like her, or whether he meant that Reuben had let the opportunity of running what would have been a thriving B&B slip through his fingers. If he had been Amish, she would have hoped that he meant the former. As she walked toward the house, she heard Shane call after her, He will never find a good woman like you, Verity. Verity spun around to face him. Thank you, Shane. That's a lovely thing to say. It's true, he said before he wound up the window. The bounce in Verity's step suddenly returned. It had been a while since she'd had male attention, and it felt good even though Shane was an Englisher. Nothing could come of anything between them, but surely she could admire Shane from a safe distance. She recalled the last time she'd had a man attempt to court her, and was shocked when she worked out that it was 4 years ago. Verity knew that it was a real possibility that she would never marry. She did her best not to think too much about it. As she walked through the doorway, she noticed there was still a light on in the house, which was unusual considering the late hour. Her father sat in his chair reading his Bible, obviously waiting for her to come home. His dog, Old Red, was lying asleep on the floor beside him. Dad, you didn't have to wait for me. Verity sat down next to him. I couldn't sleep. He placed his large black Bible on the table in front of him. Did you have any more problems? Did Reuben come back? I wanted to stay, but your mom doesn't like me spending all night at the restaurant anymore. No, he didn't. He'll probably not come back again. He said what he had to say. What was it he said to you? He accused me of sending a letter to him saying his mom was very ill in the hospital. That's the only reason he came back here, because of the letter. He came back because he thought she was in hospital. He thought you sent the letter? Verity nodded. I wouldn't even know where to send him a letter if I wanted to. I only had the address where he was when he first went away. I'm sure he wouldn't be staying in the same cheap hotel with all his millions of dollars. He moved uncomfortably in his chair. He had no business coming and upsetting you like that. I will pay his family a visit tomorrow and see if we can sort this out. Verity leaned toward her father. No, Dad. Any problems we have, I can sort out now. Don't go upsetting his family. Her father looked unconvinced, so she continued, I'm not a child for my father to sort out my problems. It's best I talk to him face to face and tell him to go from my own lips. That is, if I ever see him again. He pursed his lips tightly and looked at her over the top of his thin-rimmed spectacles. He's not Amish anymore. Don't get entangled with him or his English ways. Her eyes fell to the floor. She was ashamed that she'd ever been in love with him. I know, Dad, I won't. I remember how you two once were, but that's in the past. The Bible says not to become unequally yoked with unbelievers. Verity nodded. She knew that her father did not want her to go through any more pain, any more than she had already gone through. He stifled a yawn. Go to bed, Dad. You look tired, and you've got to get up early tomorrow. He stood up and put his Bible in the sideboard cupboard where he kept it. Good night. Old Red opened his eyes as soon as he heard Verity's father move. Good night, Dad. I'm going to make myself a tea. I'll be going to bed soon myself. He nodded and went up the stairs to his bedroom with Old Red following him. Old Red was never far away from Verity's father. I hope I've convinced him not to go and see Reuben's family. I've already been through enough embarrassment in the community, and so has his family. Verity recalled how well she'd got on with both of Reuben's parents and the rest of his family. They'd felt ashamed of Reuben when he didn't come back home, and embarrassed that he'd left his future bride without any words. I wonder how they feel about him coming back now. At least he was good enough to come home when he heard his mother was sick. At least he has some tiny piece of goodness left in him. As Verity sat in the semi-darkness sipping her hot tea, she wished she could have told Reuben she was married with children. Now he knows I was silly enough to wait years for him to return. Chapter 6. And when ye stand praying, forgive if ye have aught against any, that your Father also which is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. Matthew chapter 11 verse 25. A week went by and Verity had not heard more from Reuben, so she assumed he must have gone back to New York. That is, until she saw him striding toward her while she walked to work. She noticed that beyond him was an expensive-looking shiny black sports car parked up the road a little, and realized he must have been waiting for her. She stopped in her tracks. The animosity she had toward him was stronger than a week ago. She had found that time does not heal wounds. For Verity, time had only served to fuel her anger against him. Before you say anything, I did not send you any ridiculous letter, so can you please leave me alone? I've come to apologize to you, Verity. Verity's mouth fell open and all her planned words flew from her head. You have? Her words were broken and she stammered them out. Verity only knew how to be annoyed and angry with this man. Now she had to accept his apology. Could she do that and be angry too? For the letter. She considered that may sound rude, but she had to know whether it was only his rudeness over the letter he was apologizing for, or whether he was apologizing for never coming back to her. He should also apologize for leaving her parents with a dusty old empty barn of a building. Yes, for the letter. By his plain and simple answer, Verity could only guess that he thought he had no need to apologize for anything else. Are you saying you know that I didn't send the letter? Someone did, but I guess it wasn't you. I compared the handwriting to an old letter I found from you at my parents' house, and it wasn't the same as the handwriting from the letter saying Mom was in the hospital. Reuben looked down at the ground and rolled his shoe over some stones. I wish I knew who sent it. It was clear to Verity that Reuben did not realize exactly how offensive he was. The only reason he realized it wasn't her was because the handwriting didn't match hers, and not because he knew that it was simply something that she would never do. Just leave me alone, Reuben, please. Verity stepped past him and continued walking. He turned and walked next to her. I want to speak to you. Verity wondered what he was still doing in Lancaster County. His mother was not in hospital, so why was he still here? Verity stopped still and stared into his eyes. Apology accepted. Now I best keep going or I'll be late for work. Verity was still offended by his words, but figured he did not know any better. She nodded him a goodbye and continued on her way. Within 2 strides he caught up with her. I'll walk with you. Verity stopped and looked up at him once more. She did not want him to walk next to her or even anywhere near her. She was normally a polite person, so searched her head for something to say that would not come out rudely. I like to walk alone. I don't need any company. Yeah, I've had to get used to being alone and now I like it, she felt like saying. I haven't seen you for so long, and I just wonder how you are doing. Verity spread her arms out. Look at me, don't I look fine? Verity did not mean that the way it came out. She had not meant that she looked fine in a handsome kind of way, but rather she meant that she looked healthy and well. Reuben's dark eyes scanned her from head to toe. I must say you do look fine. Verity's legs went a little weak under his intense gaze, but she managed to steel her heart against him. She would not let herself fall victim to his whims ever again. She willed her legs to move, and they obeyed her. She walked away very quickly and spoke into the breeze. Reuben King, just go away and leave me alone. Verity knew that he was mocking her cruelly over her appearance. She certainly would not have looked attractive to him. She was a plain frump compared to his fancy English women. Anyway, I'm not going to consider my appearance like an Englisher, she decided. Verity. He strode quickly and stepped in front of her. They were face to face, she had no choice but to stop. We haven't seen each other in so long. Don't you want to know what I've been doing? He picked up her cold hands with his large warm hands and then he pressed them against his chest. The feel of his hard muscular chest against her hands made her feel weak in the knees once more, as memories of their closeness came flooding through her mind. She avoided eye contact, for she knew that if she looked into his dark eyes she might be at risk of being held captive to his whims once more. Reuben, the whole of the community knows what you've been doing. You have made millions of dollars, so there, I do know what you have been doing. You wanted to make a lot of money and now you have. Congratulations. Verity removed her hands from his chest and folded her arms, tucking her hands safely under her armpits. She wanted to beat her fists on his muscular chest and scream at him, but she contained her rage. He remained silent as he held her gaze. Do you want to know why I didn't come back? Any reason he had was no good reason as far as she was concerned, not after so many years had passed. Of course she wanted to know why he didn't come back to her, but she would not give him the satisfaction of knowing she was upset. No, I don't want to know. All I know is that you didn't come back to me, and you didn't renovate the old building like you promised my parents. Reuben King, you are nothing but a liar. Verity stepped past him and walked quickly away from him. Her walk soon turned into a run in her efforts to get away and avoid hearing more of his lies. She was out of breath when she got to the restaurant, so she sat outside on a wooden crate in the warm sun while she caught her breath. If she went in like the mess she was, her father would be most concerned. She decided not to mention that she had seen Reuben again, because they would only worry. Verity looked up as she heard the back door of the restaurant rattle. Her father moved through the door, and his face turned into a bright smile as he saw her. He waved a piece of paper at Verity. What's that, Dad? A check. Verity's father pulled up another wooden crate, sat next to her and placed the check in her hands. Verity gasped with shock when she saw the amount on the check. He tapped the check with his finger. It's more than enough to renovate the old building. She stopped staring at the check and looked at her father's happy face. Is it from Reuben? It doesn't say who it's from. It was sent to me in an envelope with no return address and no ID on the check, but it must be from him. Verity did not want to take anything from this man. Are you going to cash it? No, I'm just smiling because it would be good to have this money to renovate with. It must be from him, but I can't take money from an Englisher. Verity was relieved that he wasn't going to accept his money. It was Reuben who had put them in the bad financial situation in the first place, and now he wanted to be some sort of hero when he bailed them out. Do you think he's left town yet? Verity shrugged her shoulders. I hope so. Verity figured that was not a lie, because she did indeed hope he had left town. Chapter 7. And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you. Ephesians chapter 4 verse 32. Wedding season had come around quickly, and this time it was Ruth's turn to get married. Jed had been courting her for nearly a year. It was a Thursday in November that they had chosen to get married. As usual in the wedding season, there were other weddings on the same day, but still they expected hundreds of guests. Their wedding was to be held at the family house. Verity helped with the cooking for the 2 days before the wedding, rather than work in the restaurant. Ruth had made her own wedding dress, in a pretty shade of blue that had a hint of aqua. She'd also made a special white organza prayer cap. As Verity helped Ruth get dressed, she stifled any feelings of envy. She was very happy for her sister to get married, just as she had been happy for Sarah and Beth to get married. If Reuben had kept to his word, she would have been the first sister to be getting married, but now it was more than likely that she would never marry. Verity had dreamed of a wedding of her own for years, the food they'd have and the songs they'd sing. She looked at Ruth. You look lovely, Ruth. Thank you, Verity. Ruth fixed her hair under her cap. Someone will come for you, Verity. You just wait and see. Of course they will. Verity fixed a smile on her face. She did not want to ruin this special day for her younger sister by sharing her private agony. Despite having to hide her bitterness over being jilted, Verity always looked forward to the wedding season. Weddings were a chance to share fellowship with the rest of the community and have a joy-filled time of singing and games. Verity also enjoyed watching the young people have fun and sing into the night. Verity looked out the window and guessed that there were already around 200 people gathered outside the house, moving their way inside. Verity kissed her sister on the forehead. I'll go down and help Mom with the food. Ruth in her pretty blue linen dress smiled up at her. Thank you for your help. Verity turned and headed for the door, fearing tears might spill down her cheeks. This time they weren't tears of bitterness or sadness, they were tears of joy for her younger sister. She was happy that Ruth was getting married, and would not have to face the same shame that she had felt, the shame of waiting for a man who never came back for her. Verity could only guess how silly she must have looked to the whole community. Verity put all thoughts of shame and embarrassment out of her mind. This was Ruth's wedding day and she would not be sad. Her mother and a couple of ladies were busy working in the kitchen. What can I do to help, Mom? Nothing, everything is going nicely. We're keeping all the food warm here, and we've got the other food ready over there. Her mom pointed to the small room just off from the kitchen. Verity's mother and grandmother had weddings in the house down to a fine art. They knew exactly what to do. Once the service was underway, the bishop read from the Bible about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of love and respect. His talk went for quite a while, much longer than the actual marriage ceremony, which lasted around half an hour. Finally, Ruth and Jed were pronounced married. After the hymns had been sung, it was time for the first of the 2 meals of the day. Verity was kept busy carrying all the food out to the long rows of tables. There would have to be 3 sittings for the first meal due to the amount of people. The food, as usual at a wedding, was plenteous. There were different varieties of roast meats and roast vegetables, a range of salads, coleslaw, pickles, hot peppers, and all kinds of relishes. Once the main meal was finished, Verity's favorite, the desserts, would be served. There were 3 main large wedding cakes and many smaller cakes and desserts. Verity was sure she had never seen so much food, not at any of the weddings she had ever attended. After everyone had eaten their fill, Verity looked around her, pleased that everyone was having a good time. Then she spied Reuben's mother, Betsy. She had always gotten along well with Betsy, but when she realized that Reuben was not coming home, Verity had stopped visiting her. Betsy looked up from talking to David, her husband, and caught Verity's eye. Now Verity had to go over and speak to her. "Hello, Mrs. King." "Hello, Verity, it's nice to see you. Sit down." Betsy tapped the bench next to her. Verity smiled and nodded at Mr. King, who nodded back to her. "Verity, I haven't seen you for so long." Verity swallowed hard. "Yes, it has been a while." The smile on Mrs. King's face reached her eyes. "Are you still working at the restaurant?" "Yeah." Verity adjusted her prayer cap. This was going to be an awkward conversation. "Are you enjoying Reuben's visit?" Verity thought it best to bring up the subject of Reuben, rather than avoid speaking of him. "It was a good surprise to see him, but he's not staying with us." Verity's eyes grew wide. "He's not?" "No, he's staying in town. He said he would not stay somewhere with no electricity. He complained that he wasn't able to use his computer. He called it a laptop or something of the sort." Mrs. King laughed. "I know nothing of his world." "I'm glad to see that you're both looking well." Verity glanced over at Mr. King, who smiled back at her. Reuben looked a perfect mixture of both his parents. He had a large frame like his father, but his dark hair and eyes he got from his mom. "Yeah, the Lord's keeping us well." Verity wondered how Reuben could have been born from two such lovely people. She had thought at one time that he was lovely, but now she knew just how horrible he really was. Verity immediately cast her negative thoughts from her mind. She was aware of the awkward silence, and sat there on the old wooden bench seat at a total loss to know what to say to these two people. The smile left Reuben's mom's face as she said, "He's sorry for what he's done to you." Verity looked into Mrs. King's kindly eyes. "You mean Reuben?" Mrs. King nodded, and Verity noticed that the look on her face was a look of sympathy. Verity laughed. "Why, he's nothing to be sorry for. He's done nothing to me." Anger rose within Verity. Was she now an object of pity, as well as an object of ridicule? "I didn't say that to upset you, Verity. The two of you were inseparable from the time you were both 10 years old. Everyone was sure you would marry." Mrs. King put her small hand on Verity's wrist. Verity had thought this conversation might turn awkward, and it had. "I'm not upset. Anyway, if you'll excuse me, I have to go and help Mom." Verity stood up and dipped her head to Mr. and Mrs. King, before she turned and walked back to the kitchen. "Yeah, we were nearly every day with each other from 10 years old. That's why I believed him when he said he'd come back and we'd be married. I thought I knew that he wasn't a liar." Verity immediately felt a tight knot in the pit of her stomach. She went over those words, "Sorry for what he's done to me." Have I turned out to be that wretched and disgusting? What did his mother mean exactly by those words? Verity wondered if there was ever going to be any rest for her, or any escape from the dark shadow that Reuben had cast over her life. Verity had to admit she was partly to blame. Her mom and dad had tried to encourage her to consider other boys as years passed. It was she who'd stuck doggedly to the belief that Reuben would come back and marry her as planned. Was it wrong to trust someone and to take them at their word? That's all she had done. She had trusted Reuben and had been blind to the truth that stared her in the face. For most of the rest of the day, Verity washed up the many plates, until her hands were wrinkled from the hot sudsy water. When she heard the young people start up their singing in the evening, her heart was joyful once more. The youth were always so bright and happy that they reminded her of her own happy, carefree youthful days. Her mind cast back to the days she'd attended weddings with Reuben. They'd had so much fun, and sometimes they'd pretended it was their own wedding. He'd always made her laugh so much. But she wasn't laughing now. She had been a fool to trust him despite the evidence before her eyes. A thought occurred to her, at least he had left the community. How horrible would it be if he had returned to the community and married another woman? The corners of Verity's lips turned upwards a little. She realized she could handle the pain if she did not have to see him. She hoped that he would return to New York very soon. Verity knew that she would most likely never stop thinking about Reuben, but she would just have to live with that. Every single day over the past 6 years she had pictured him and wondered what he was doing. Sometimes she would even close her eyes and pretend that he was standing in front of her. He was nothing like the Reuben she had held in her mind's eye. The Reuben she had been in love with and pined for was Amish. The Reuben who had returned from New York was an Englisher. Chapter 8. Let all your things be done with charity. 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verse 14. Ruth's wedding was still very much on her mind the next day as Verity walked to work. She had not even given two thoughts to Reuben that whole morning, until she heard the low hum of a car behind her. She turned to see Reuben's proud display of wealth, his expensive car, drive slowly past her. The car pulled up on the side of the road in front of her. The car door opened and Reuben stepped out. "Verity, please listen. I have some things I need to say to you." She knew she was trapped on a road that hardly saw traffic. If she told him to go away, he would argue with her. It was easier just to let him have his say. "Yeah, I'll give you 2 minutes. I'm running late for work. I'll give you a ride to work." Verity took a step backward. "No." Reuben took a small step forward. "Even before I came back here, I came to realize that all the money in the world was not going to make me happy." He ran a large hand over his cropped hair and took 2 steps toward her. "I bought a big house, and thought I would be happier if I bought an even bigger one. A few years later, I bought an even bigger house. I stood in that big, empty grand house, and I realized that I was not happy at all. I was empty." Verity swallowed hard. Did Reuben want to return to her after all this time? He continued, "When I came back and saw you, I had a deep feeling within me that I was home. Verity, wherever you are is home for me." He placed a large hand over his heart. "That is where I belong, with you. I know that now. It took me a long time, but I know that now. I know now that I had everything I could ever want before I even left for New York, but I just didn't know it until very recently." Verity's breathing started to quicken, and she could feel her heart pumping hard against her chest. This is what she had wanted to hear for so long, but she had wanted to hear it years ago, not now. She took a deep breath and pushed her shoulders back. "It's too late, Reuben. It's too late for us." Reuben drew his eyebrows together and deep lines appeared in his forehead. "It's not too late. I've come back to you. I want things to go back to how they were." "It's too late for me, Reuben. You should have come back when you said you would. I'm not going to accept you've come back after so many years, like nothing has happened." She wanted to call him a liar. She wanted to beat her hands on his powerful chest and hurt him like he'd hurt her for all those years. "Can you forgive me for leaving you for so long and never contacting you? I've been a fool." He held her gaze with urgent eyes. "Say you forgive me?" "Reuben, I can forgive you, but we cannot be together. I won't accept you or what you've done to me." He dipped his head slightly and spoke softly, "Verity, I want to marry you." There it was, the word she had wanted to hear again for so long, but the words had been too late in coming. She expelled her breath slowly and spoke the words she needed to say. "Reuben, I do not want to marry you." His fists clenched beside him. "Are you in love with someone else? Is it that man who works with you, the blonde one with the handsome face? I saw you talking to him outside the restaurant." Verity took a side step past him and continued walking. "No, Reuben, please just leave me alone. Just accept I've forgiven you and let it be left there. I must go." Verity forgave him in her heart for everything he had done, but nothing could take away the pain he had caused, the loneliness and the abandonment. Her heart was damaged so much that not even Reuben coming back to her was enough to heal it. As Verity walked away, Reuben called after her, "I'm coming back to the community, Verity. I've talked to the bishop and I'm getting baptized. I'm through with the English lifestyle. I'm truly sorry for what I've done. I've been a fool. I won't give up on you. All my money, and all the things I have are nothing if I don't have you in my life." "Too late, Reuben, that is something you should have known long ago." She turned away from him, and continued walking, as if Reuben's return to the Amish did not bother her at all. The truth was that Reuben coming back to the community was the worst news Verity had heard in her whole life. She did not want to continually see this man who had hurt her so much. It was one thing that she thought about him every single day, but it was quite another to have to see him nearly every day. She wished things could go back to how they were before he had come back. At that exact moment she noticed Shane's pickup truck had passed her and was slowing down. He stopped his truck and she ran to get in without looking back or saying another word to Reuben. It was only when the truck was speeding away that she turned back to look at Reuben. He was standing still, staring after the truck. "Thank you for rescuing me, Shane." Shane looked in his rearview mirror. Sure looked like you needed rescuing. That guy giving you trouble, Verity? No. I'm so glad you've come past just when you did. Why aren't you at work? Your father sent me to get some things from the markets. I swung by your place to see if you wanted a lift to work, but they said you'd already left. Thanks, Shane, that was sweet. Verity looked behind her again to see Reuben standing in front of his car with his arms folded across his chest, and his eyes were still fixed on Shane's truck. Chapter 9. He that loveth not knoweth not God. For God is love. 1 John chapter 4 verse 8. The next Sunday there was no meeting, and since no one ever worked on a Sunday, Verity had an opportunity to think about her life. Verity took Old Red, the family's dog, for a walk through the fields next to the house. Old Red was always good company. He always listened and agreed with everything she said. Although Old Red was the family's dog, it was clear Old Red was devoted to Verity's father. Her father had found Old Red outside the restaurant 5 years ago, cold, thin, hungry, and looking for food. He took him home with him that night, put him on a warm blanket, and gave him food. They did not know what type of dog he was, but they knew he was old and was red, so they named him Old Red. The walk helped Verity to clear her head of all the clutter that had accumulated over many years. It must be very hard for him to give up all his money, the fortune he spent years building, and leave all his cars and houses behind. Was she the one being the fool? Wasn't it what she'd always wanted for Reuben to come back to her and say he was sorry? This was exactly what she'd been praying for over many years. It was only the stubborn bitterness in her heart that was standing in the way of her happiness. Or maybe it was pride. Whatever it was, her prayers had been answered. Reuben had come back to her. She had to accept the gift being offered. She recalled what the bishop had said to her just before she was baptized. Salvation is like a gift. All you have to do is accept the gift. Verity figured it was the same as an answer to prayer. All she had to do was accept it. It was as if a warm light was spreading over Verity's entire being. She could finally have everything she always wanted. She could have Reuben, a home, and she could have children. If she accepted him back, she could have a baby 2 years from now, providing they got married next wedding season. She decided not to let pride stand in her way of happiness. She would go see Reuben and tell him that she would agree to marry him. Verity knew he was staying at the most expensive hotel in town. When I get back from my walk, I will ask Faith to hitch the buggy and take me into town. As Faith drove her toward the hotel in the buggy, she turned to Verity and said, "So it turned out well then, did it? That he got a letter telling him his mother was sick." Verity was so happy she giggled like a girl. "I suppose it did." Faith continued, "So are you happy someone sent him a letter?" Verity studied her sister's face. "Faith, tell me it wasn't you." Faith stared at the road ahead, increased her grip on the reins, and raised her eyebrows slightly without saying a word. "Faith, that was a terrible thing to do." Faith glanced over at Verity. "Well, it worked out for the best, didn't it?" Verity shrugged her shoulders. "I just couldn't stand to see you sitting around with a wretched look on your face all the time. I knew you were thinking about him all the time. I thought it best you talk to him, and then maybe the two of you could work something out." "Work something out?" "Well, I don't know. I was only trying to help. I wanted you to be happy again. I was certain when he saw you, he'd fall in love with you again. You're not going to tell anyone I wrote it, are you? The damage is done now. I suppose no one has to know." Phew, Mom and Dad would not be pleased if they found out about it. Verity rubbed the back of her neck to relieve the tension that ached. "It was nice of you to try to help, but please don't ever help me again." "I just had to, Verity, or you would have turned into a bitter old woman before too long." Verity was glad when the buggy stopped in front of the hotel, as now she no longer had to listen to what Faith had to say. She knew it was true what Faith was saying. She would have become a bitter old lady. The bitterness in her heart ached like sharp hunger pangs. "Thanks, Faith. Don't wait for me, I'll be home later." Verity was looking forward to seeing the look on Reuben's face when she told him she would marry him. She hoped he would put his strong arms around her like he used to so she could feel safe once more. The receptionist told her his room was number 308. Verity bypassed the elevator and took the stairs to the 3rd floor. By the time she had climbed the stairs, her heart was thumping and her mouth was dry. She raised her hand and knocked on the door. After a moment, the door flung open and Verity was face to face with a tall blonde lady with a heavily made-up face. It was obvious by the way this Englisher looked Verity up and down that she was surprised to see an Amish person. "Yes? I'm sorry, I must have the wrong room. I was looking for Reuben." The Englisher's tone was uncertain as she asked, "Who are you looking for?" Verity took a small step back. "Surely this is not his room." "Reuben King." The English woman's eyes ran slowly and carefully over Verity before she spoke in an aggressive tone. "I'm Reuben's fiancée, Brittany, and who are you?" An instant wave of nausea caused Verity to press her hands against her stomach. "Is his what?" Brittany opened the door wider, giving Verity full view of the room. Verity looked in to see Reuben sitting on a large bed. A look of shock came over his face as their eyes locked. Verity turned and ran. What a fool she'd been, a fool to trust a liar. Once a liar, always a liar, the saying must be true. She could hear Reuben running after her. "Verity, let me explain." Verity picked up her dress and lifted it higher so she could run down the stairs with greater speed. She ran down the stairs as fast as she could to the sound of Reuben running close behind her. How much more can this man embarrass and humiliate me? She wanted to run and never stop. "Stop, Verity. It's not what it looks like." Once Verity reached the bottom of the stairs, she managed to squeeze in front of a porter who was struggling with a large collection of baggage. She heard the sounds of Reuben colliding with the bags behind her, but she kept running. She ran right out the door onto the sidewalk. Verity ran out on the road, forgetting about cars and buses. The next thing she knew, she heard the deafening sound of a car's horn sounding in front of her. A large car speeded toward her. Two large hands around her waist pulled her heavily backward to the sidewalk. For a moment, Verity was engulfed in darkness. She opened her eyes to see Reuben kneeling on the ground, leaning over her, cradling her head in his arms. She looked into his familiar dark eyes and wanted to stay there forever until she remembered the last few moments. She had just seen a woman in his room, a woman who said she was his fiancée. "Are you all right? Verity, say something, speak to me." Verity saw people had gathered around, looking down at her. Her instincts told her to stay there in his arms for as long as possible, but common sense said otherwise. "Let me be. Let me go. You need to get her to the hospital." The doorman from the hotel was also looking down at her. "Shall I call an ambulance?" He directed the question to Reuben. Verity answered before Reuben had a chance to speak. "No, I'll not go to any hospital." She sat up while trying to wriggle out of his arms. Reuben resisted her movements and moved his hands to her shoulders. "I'll take you to the hospital, you might have concussion or something." "The only place I'm going is home." Verity got to her feet, and although she felt a little woozy, she knew she had to get away from this man. He rose to his feet at the same time as she did. "I'll drive you home." "No." She gathered all her strength so she could speak to him firmly. Her gaze remained straight ahead as she said, "There is nothing to explain. Everything is perfectly clear to me." Verity knew he was a liar. He had asked her to marry him, but he already had an English fiancée. It did not make any sense. Reuben had never made any sense. Reuben drew his eyebrows together. "At least let me drive you home." "No." Verity looked at the doorman. "Call a taxi for me, would you?" The doorman tipped his head and hurried back into the hotel. Reuben spoke to the few people who were gathered. "She's all right, thank you for your concern." The people moved away. Verity smoothed down her dress and tried to brush some dirt off. "I'll be fine. You go back to Brittany, your fiancée." Reuben cleared his throat. "Let me explain about Brittany, Verity, please." Reuben opened his mouth to continue to speak, but stopped when Verity covered both ears with the palms of her hands and turned her gaze from him. Verity could not even look at him after he'd mentioned another woman's name. Faith ran to the door of the taxi when it pulled up in front of the house. Her happy expression changed to concern when she saw Verity's face. "You look dreadful. What happened?" Verity paid the taxi driver, and when the car had pulled away she spoke. "The whole thing was a total disaster. I was nearly run over by a car." Faith put her hand over her mouth. Was Reuben there? Faith grabbed Verity's hand. Come sit. She led her to the chairs on the porch. Faith, be a dear and make me some lemon tea with 2 large teaspoons of honey. Then I'll tell you everything that happened. Yeah, you just stay here. Faith disappeared into the house. All Verity felt was numbness in both mind and in body. She hoped the sweetness of the tea would help her to feel better. Here we go, I made it not too hot so you can drink it straight away. Thank you, Faith. Verity took a large mouthful of the tea, and the warmness was like a wave washing through her. She could feel her sister's eyes on her, waiting for her to begin her story. First, I knocked on his door and another woman answered. Faith's eyes grew wide. She said she was Reuben's fiancé. What? Fiancé? Faith licked her lips. Yeah, fiancé. Then I ran away and Reuben ran after me, saying he wanted to explain, and then I nearly ran in front of a car. Faith's hands flew to her mouth and she sat up straighter in her chair. Oh, that's horrible. You weren't hurt at all, were you? How do you feel? Verity's eyes were drawn to the fields in front of the house. I feel stupid, that's how I feel, stupid and humiliated. How could I have trusted him again? It's happening all over again. Faith looked thoughtful. He said he wanted to explain, did you let him? Verity forced a laugh. What, and hear more of his lies? I needed to get far, far away from him. I never want to see him again. I wish he'd never come back. Verity took another mouthful of tea. Faith leaned back in her chair. I'm sorry, Verity. I'm sorry I wrote that letter. I won't meddle again. It's not your fault. It's mine for trusting someone again who never, ever deserved to be trusted. Faith patted Verity on the arm. I'll bring you some cookies. Verity smiled and nodded, but she knew it would take far more than cookies to mend her heart. Chapter 10. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man laid down his life for his friends. John chapter 15 verse 13. Verity decided the best thing she could do was to put Reuben totally out of her mind, and concentrate on the things that made her happy. She enjoyed working with her friend Lily, especially during the time they spent together cleaning after the restaurant closed each day. She enjoyed her walks with Old Red and tending her herb and vegetable garden. Reuben had not even tried to contact her since that day after she was nearly run over. She did not know if he had gone back to New York or stayed in Lancaster County. The door of the restaurant opened, and Verity instinctively looked up as it was her job to seat the customers. To her horror, it was Reuben with a male friend. She poked Lily, who stood next to her. Lily, it's Reuben. You go and seat them. Lily did not reply to Verity, but simply approached the 2 gentlemen and seated them at a table in the back of the restaurant, as far from the reception area as possible. Verity was grateful for Lily's quick thinking. Verity was sure her father would have asked him to leave, but today her father was not working. I wonder if he knows Dad wouldn't be here today, she thought. Verity was staring at the 2 men from behind the cash register, when Reuben suddenly lifted his gaze and looked straight into her eyes. She immediately looked away, but not before sharp tingles made their way through her whole body. Lily returned to finish making the coffees. Don't you worry, I'll look after them. I could ask Shane to tell them to leave if you want. I thought of that, but I don't want to create a scene. I could leave too, but we're short-staffed today. Verity took some deep breaths as she tried to calm her racing heart. No, leave if you want to. We can manage without you. We can take Faith out of the kitchen and she can help wait the tables. Verity decided it would be best for her to stay. She would not run away as if she had done wrong. This was her family's restaurant. If anyone felt they should not be there, it should be him. Verity wondered where his fiancé was, and hoped she would not be joining them. That would be far too uncomfortable. Surely he wouldn't parade her under my nose. Verity thought. No, I will stay. Verity shot another glance at the 2 men and noticed Reuben was not dressed in Amish clothes, but was dressed in a dark English business suit. So much for his talk of getting baptized and coming back to the Amish way of life, Verity thought. It was weeks ago he told me he was returning, and he obviously hasn't. Verity's attention was drawn to the man sitting with Reuben. He appeared to be around the same age as Reuben, and looked a little like the English man who had encouraged Reuben to go to New York all those years ago. Yeah, it could be his business partner. Why are they here? Why aren't they in New York? Snap out of it, Verity. Verity became aware from Lily's hissed words that Lily had been speaking to her, trying to get her attention. I need you to take these coffees to table 5. Lily pushed a tray toward her, which contained a café latte, a cappuccino and an espresso. Yeah, sorry, Lily. Lily began frothing the milk for more cappuccinos. The kitchen's been ringing the bell too. Okay. Verity felt she could very well faint, but there was no time for that. The kitchen was ringing a bell telling her there were more meals to take to the tables. Verity hoped she would not have to go anywhere near the table where Reuben and his friend were. Why did he come to this restaurant, with so many other restaurants in town? As Lily had promised, she took the food and the drinks order from Reuben and his friend. Verity had no need to go near them at all. After a good hour and 2 large meals later, it finally looked like Reuben and his friend were ready to leave. His friend took a packet of cigarettes out of his pocket and headed outside, while Reuben headed directly to the cash register. Yes, he waited until I was right behind the register, Verity whispered to Lily, who was in the middle of making coffees. Swap places with me quickly. Lily whispered back, it's too late. Anyway, he can just as easy talk to you if you are standing in this spot. Verity knew Lily was right, but if Lily and she had swapped places, at least she wouldn't have been face to face with Reuben. Verity was biting at her lips and doing the best she could to avoid eye contact with him. He's come here deliberately to punish me. He knows I can't tell him to go away in a crowded place. Reuben fixed his eyes on Verity as he strode toward her. He handed her a $50 note. Keep the change. Verity calculated the change in her head and handed it back to him. I don't want the change, thank you. Reuben took the change and placed it back down on the counter. Verity, I need to talk to you. His voice was strained. Verity pushed the money along the counter toward him. Now is not the time or the place. Tell me when and where then. Reuben gazed into her face, ignoring the money in front of him. You misunderstood me. I don't want to speak to you at all, ever. So kindly don't come here again. If Dad had been here, he would never have let you in through the door. Brittany's not my fiancée. Well, she was a while ago. Verity straightened her back and lifted her chin slightly. Anyway, whether she is or she isn't, it's none of my concern. You can do whatever you want with whomever you wish. Verity walked out from behind the cash register and pointed to the door. There's the door. Verity noticed Reuben's friend stood just outside the front door of the restaurant with a lit cigarette. Reuben walked out the door, half turning back as if he were searching for something to say. There was nothing he could say that would make any difference. Verity felt a tug on her arm and looked around to see Lily. Pay him no mind, forget him. Lily looked at the patrons in the restaurant. Some people are looking. Forget him, just like that. It was so easy to say, but what Lily did not realize was that Verity had spent years trying to forget him. Verity quietly went about her business and tried her best to put him right out of her mind. It's just like him to want to come to where I work and create a scene, she thought. He's so selfish. Finally, it was closing time. The rest of the staff had left the restaurant, leaving Lily and Verity to do the usual clean-up. Did you recognize the man who was with Reuben? Verity asked Lily. No, I don't recall seeing him before. Lily was probably too young to remember the man, that is if he was the same horrible Englisher who had lured Reuben away. Anyway, it didn't matter who lured him away, he could obviously be lured away, which means he didn't really want to stay with me. Stop it, Verity, stop it, she mentally screamed to herself. She was not going to go over the whole thing again, this is what she had been doing for years. Verity thought it best not to mention to her father the whole incident of Reuben coming to the restaurant. It would just upset him, and he will then worry about me wherever I go. After they finished their nightly cleanup, Verity said goodbye to Lily and locked the door. The November air was freezing, and Verity thought it best to have Faith come to pick her up from now on, as the weather was only going to get colder. Just as Verity stepped onto the road, a car pulled quickly in front of her and stopped. She knew in an instant it was Reuben's car. The driver's side door opened, and Reuben stood next to his gleaming, highly polished car. "Get in before you catch your death of cold." Verity would have loved to be driven home if it had been by anyone else. "No, I'm fine, thank you." Verity pulled her thick black coat up further around her neck as she walked past his car. "Verity, please just listen to what I have to say." Verity turned to face him. "Maybe if I listen to what he has to say, I will finally be free of him and he can go on his way back to New York." "Okay, speak." "Well, get in the car, it's freezing." The car was warm, which made Verity a little grateful she had accepted his offer. Verity looked at all the different colored lights on the dashboard and on the steering wheel. She recognized the seat she was sitting on was made of the softest leather she had ever sat in. "I wonder how much a car like this costs." Reuben started the car. At least the drive home is short, Verity thought, as she tried to ignore his close familiar scent. The motor ran, but the car wasn't going anywhere. Reuben turned to face her. "Brittany is not my fiancée. What I mean is, she used to be when I was in New York. As soon as I got here and saw you, I called her and told her things between her and me just would not work. I called off the engagement. She came here to see what was wrong with me. Brittany and I are finished with each other." Verity fixed her eyes on Reuben. With the frustration built up over many years, she hit her fist as hard as she could on his expensive dashboard. "That's more than I got, Reuben. You never even told me you weren't coming back. Why did you tell her things were over between you and her, when you never even bothered to tell me that things were over between us?" Reuben looked away from her and hung his head. Despite the pain in her hand, which she might have broken, she continued, "John Miller wanted to court me, Dan Yoder wanted to court me, and I would not have anything to do with either of them. Now they are both married with children. Either of those two men would have made me a fine husband." Verity noticed the shocked expression on Reuben's face, but that only fueled her rage. "I believed you when you said you were coming back, and I missed all my opportunities of happiness. Why couldn't you have just done the right thing and told me you didn't want to marry me? Couldn't you have just done one decent thing in your life?" Reuben rubbed his chin. "I couldn't tell you I didn't want to marry you because I did want to. I did for the longest time. After years went by, it didn't seem appropriate to talk to you. Too much time had passed. I thought you would have gotten on with your life without me." His words were spoken softly. Verity leaned toward him with her eyes very round. "Not appropriate? Did you think it was appropriate for me to wait for you for years without hearing one word from you?" Verity stared at him, waiting for an answer. When no answer came, Verity pushed herself back into the plush leather and said, "Don't feed me any more lies, Reuben King. If you intended to return, you would have contacted me and said so. Instead, I heard nothing from you." His silence was doing nothing to dull her temper, so she continued, "You come back here and the first thing you do is accuse me of some nonsense about writing a letter." Verity put her hand on her heart. It was thumping so wildly she thought it would jump out of her chest. "And you're also engaged to someone else." "I'm not engaged anymore, I've already told you that." Reuben's words were slow and deliberate. Verity put her elbow on the door beside her, and put her hand on her forehead. "I can only imagine what you've put that poor girl through." Reuben gripped the steering wheel and looked straight at Verity. "I'm sorry for what I've done. I'm sorry I never contacted you, and I'm sorry I'm such an idiot." Verity turned her head away from him. She felt better now she had told him how he had wronged her. "Apology accepted. Now you best get me home or Dad will come out looking for me." Reuben started the car and pulled onto the road. "I don't think you understand me, Verity. I want to marry you." Verity could feel Reuben looking at her, but did not take her eyes off the road. "I understand you perfectly well, Reuben. You want to marry me, again. But I don't want to marry you. I can't trust you, I don't think your heart is right toward God, and you're not Amish anymore." Reuben's gaze alternated between the road and Verity. "What about forgiveness, Verity?" "I forgive you." Verity deliberately made sure her tone was as icy as her heart. She did forgive him, but she would never forget what he did. "If you truly forgive me from the heart, you would marry me." "Stop the car." Verity was going to make him see her point for once and for all. He slowed the car, then stopped it on the roadside. Verity faced him, and leaned against the door so she would be as far away from him as possible. Understand this, Reuben King. I can forgive the Englisher who drove my uncle's buggy off the road, but I'm not going to marry him. I can forgive the man who ordered a big lunch at the restaurant yesterday and ran off without paying, but I am not going to marry him. I can forgive you for saying you'd marry me, then going to New York for 6 months, then not coming back for 6 years. I can forgive you for never contacting me, but I'm not going to marry you. Verity looked into Reuben's dark eyes and continued, So do you see? Do you see how it is? Verity congratulated herself for keeping her voice calm and not screaming at him. I can forgive you, but I will never marry you. So don't wear yourself out asking me. Verity waved her hand toward the road. Now you can keep going. Reuben turned the car back onto the road, and neither of them said another word the short distance to her home. Verity leapt out of the car as soon as it pulled in front of her house. She turned around to close the door and leaned down to speak to him. When do you go back to New York? Verity, I already told you I'm not going back to New York. I'm back here for good. Verity closed the door and walked to the house. She did not look back at the car and breathed a long sigh of relief when she heard the low humming sound of the car's motor moving off up the long driveway. What does he mean he's not going back to New York? He's still driving that ridiculously expensive car wearing English clothes, and he hasn't even been baptized. Maybe he plans to stay in town and live here as an Englisher. As soon as she closed the front door, she heard what could only be her father's footsteps coming down the stairs from his bedroom. Was that Reuben who brought you home? His face was full of concern. Old Red was standing beside him looking at her as well. Yeah, it was. I will ask Faith to pick me up from work from now on. It's getting too cold to walk. You're not thinking of letting him back into your life, are you? Verity crouched down and put her hands out to Old Red, who came toward her for a pat. No. Don't worry, Dad. Please go back to bed. I told him I wanted nothing to do with him. I only let him drive me home so he could say what he wanted to get it off his chest. Now hopefully he'll leave me alone. All right, good night. He smiled at her and walked back upstairs. As always, Old Red was not far behind him, like a faithful shadow. Good night, Dad. Chapter 11. And above all things have fervent charity among yourselves. For charity shall cover the multitude of sins. 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 8. Are you going to the barn raising on Saturday, Verity? Faith asked over dinner. No, I have to work on Saturday. Faith directed her attention to her father. Do you need me at work, Dad, or can I go to the barn raising? If you're not on the roster, you can go, Faith. Oh, good. Faith clapped her hands. I love going to barn raisings and seeing everyone there. I love it when the whole community comes together. Verity tried to remember the last time she had been to a barn raising. It had been a very long time. She considered barn raisings and weddings good opportunities to look for a husband, but she had given up on trying to find a husband long ago. Maybe you should go, Verity. I'll see if Beth or Sarah can work for you instead, her father said. Beth and Sarah were Verity's 2 older sisters, who both worked in the restaurant during busy times or in emergencies. Grandmother said, Yeah, I think you should go, Verity. No, I would prefer to go to work. Verity knew her father and her grandmother thought the same thing. It would be a good place for her to meet a husband. Verity spooned a dollop of mashed sweet potato onto her plate. Now that's settled, I'm going to work. Verity caught her parents exchanging glances. They wanted to get her married to someone, anyone except Reuben. They were not happy with the way he had treated her. It was the first Saturday night of the month, the day that Verity's father had arranged a family dinner. With the odd times that they all worked at the restaurant, it was rare that they all sat down to have dinner together. Of course, it wasn't so important now that her sisters Ruth, Beth, and Sarah were married. Now only Faith and Verity were left at home with their dad, mom, and grandmother. It had seemed like Verity's day at work had been 2 days instead of 1. Since Faith was at the barn raising, she wasn't able to drive Verity home. Lily had offered that her father could drive her home in his buggy. Thank you for the lift, bye. Verity stood and waved to Lily and Lily's father as the buggy clip-clopped up the driveway. Before she had reached the 2 front steps to the house, Faith came running out to meet her. Verity, you'll never guess. Verity noticed Faith's eyes were wide with excitement. What is it? Come and sit. Faith grabbed Verity's hand and sat her down on one of the 3 wooden porch chairs. Reuben was at the barn raising. What? Verity was shocked by the sound of her high-pitched voice. She took a calming breath before she asked, what was he doing there? Helping, and he was in Amish clothes. I asked some questions and found out the bishop has baptized him already. No. Verity was ashamed of herself. She should be happy someone was baptized just as she had been baptized years before. He's come back to the Amish? Yeah. He was in Amish clothes and helping with the barn raising and all. Not only that, he's living back in his parents' house. Verity looked straight ahead into the darkness of the distant trees. She clutched at her chest in an effort to still her aching heart. This time her heart didn't ache out of love, it ached with anxiousness and dread. For years I've been pining for this man, and he comes back as if 6 years has been 6 months and expects me to run into his arms as if nothing has happened. As if I hadn't wondered when he'd be back, and as if I hadn't wondered what he'd been doing. Wondering if he still loves me. He even had a fiancée, and goodness knows how many other women he has had. Verity wasn't sure if she was going mad, or if it was the rest of the world going mad. She was torn in two. She needed to speak to the bishop, maybe he would be able to help her. She hoped Reuben had come back to the Amish for the right reasons, and not on a whim like the whim that took him when he disappeared to New York so long ago. It would have been much easier for her if he'd gone back to New York, instead of staying in Lancaster County. Now she must see him from time to time. Verity let out a deep breath. Her life before Reuben showed up was much easier than now that he was here. She wished he had never come back. Verity, why do you look so upset? Aren't you pleased? He's back. Faith leaned in and whispered to Verity, my letter worked. Feeling wretched, Verity leaned forward and put her head into her hands. No, I'm not pleased. I wish he had never come back. What are you saying? You've been in love with him and only him for as long as I can remember. Don't you see? I can never trust him again. Verity had no energy to explain anything to her sister. Faith frowned and crossed her arms in front of her. All I can see, Verity, is that you wanted him when you couldn't have him. Now you can have him, you don't want him. You told me you didn't even listen to him when he wanted to explain about the girl in his room. I think you only want something when you can't have it. Faith jutted out her chin and fixed her large blue eyes on Verity, defying her to disagree. Verity dabbed at her eyes. It's not like that. You just don't understand anything. She stood up to go inside the house. As she walked inside, she heard Faith say, it's you who doesn't understand anything. Verity kept her eyes fixed on the ground. The last thing she wanted to do was fight with any members of her family. Her family was all she had. Yet they had no way of understanding her pain, the terrible pain of heartbreak and a pain that could never be cured. Verity much preferred to arrive home in the semi-darkness after everyone had gone to bed, but tonight everyone was still awake, because they had only just arrived back from the barn raising. Now it seemed as though everyone was encroaching on her private space. She made herself a hot tea and took it up to her bedroom where she could be alone. Verity's mom and dad made no mention of Reuben being at the barn raising, and made no mention that he had been baptized. They most likely don't want to upset me. As Verity sat on her bed and sipped her hot tea, she was a little angry with herself for not being satisfied with her previous situation. It was much easier being a jilted woman when the one who had done the jilting lived far away. Now she had to live with the aggravation and the embarrassment of having him right under her nose in the very same community. Just when Verity thought she had escaped from everyone, there was a knock on her door. Yeah. The door was pushed open and her mom came inside her room. We should talk. Verity put her tea down on her nightstand. The last thing she felt like doing was talking. What about? Her mom sat on the edge of Verity's bed next to her. Reuben. Verity opened her mouth to speak, but her mother spoke before she had a chance. I hear that he asked you to marry him again. Verity's mouth fell open. Who told you such a thing? Never you mind who told me. Why didn't you say you'd marry him? Mom, I can't trust him after what he did to me. Verity took off her prayer cap and unpinned the braids that had been hidden under the cap. Her mom pushed back her shoulders and took a deep breath. That was a long time ago. God says you should forgive people if they ask you to. Forgive them 70 times 7. Verity ran her hands through her hair, unraveling her braids. I have forgiven him, Mom. I have forgiven him, but I don't want to risk my heart getting hurt again. Verity picked up her brush and ran it through the length of her hair. It's much easier for me if I stay away from him. I'm surprised you think I should marry him after what he did to me. Her mom threw her hands in the air and spoke quickly. What life will you have? You haven't even considered another man. Verity interrupted her. I would have considered another man if I had known Reuben was never coming back, but now they're all too old or too young. God has put him in front of you for a reason. Don't you want to be married and have some children? Verity threw the brush on the bed next to her. Yeah, but what if he runs away again? He's done it once. He's been baptized now and made a commitment to the Amish faith. Some men don't grow up in their head until they are older, sometimes until they are about 30. Verity had always taken a lot of notice of what her mother said, as she was always very practical and sensible. Does Dad agree with what you're saying? Your father isn't in your position, only you are. Only you know what you want. I think you don't see what it is you really want, because all you can see is the pain of the past. The past is over and gone. Verity knew her mom was skirting around her question. Verity knew her father was not happy with Reuben. Mom, who told you he asked me to marry him? She tried to remember if she had told anyone. She was sure she hadn't told anyone, not even Lily, with whom she shared most things. It's not important. Now you get some sleep. There's the meeting at Beth's place tomorrow. Verity's mom leaned over, kissed her on the forehead, and left the room. Her mom was not going to divulge who told her about Reuben asking her to marry him, so there was no use Verity even asking her again. Verity picked up her tea and found that it had turned cold. Like my heart, she thought. Now she would have to see Reuben at the meeting at Beth's place tomorrow. The restaurant was closed every Sunday, as Sundays were a day of rest, as set down by God. Every second Sunday, the Amish services were held at different folks' houses. Tomorrow it was the turn of Beth, Verity's sister, to have it at her house. Does everyone think nothing of what Reuben has done to me? 6 long years with no contact at all. I could have married another man in those early years, if only I had known he wasn't coming back. The love I feel for him has never changed, but what good is that if he is not here with me? Verity had thought about Reuben every single day, and every single night of the past 6 years. It dawned on Verity that it takes more than love to make someone happy, it also takes trust, and Reuben had shown he was not someone who could be trusted. He's heartless, he's a heartless person. He's not only heartless but also rude and inconsiderate. Didn't he even once consider what I have been going through, waiting every day for 6 years, waiting to hear from him? Why does he care about me now and want to marry me? For all he knew, while he was in New York, I might have gotten married, and he didn't care about that then. Why does he care so much now? Unless a miracle occurred, she was never going to find someone suitable to marry. She could always marry an aging widower, but Verity wanted children and wanted to have them with a husband who was close to her age. It's clear that Mom thinks I should take him up on his offer of marriage. I can forgive him, but I cannot trust him. Verity reinforced her own opinion and knew that she was making the right decision. She was sure her dad did not agree with her mom. No, he would not want me to be with Reuben, after all that he has done, and he doesn't even know about the English fiancé. Verity did believe Reuben when he told her that he had discontinued the relationship with his fiancée. Not carrying things through to their conclusion was something that Reuben was well practiced at. She would never be able to get over the shock of knocking on his door and having another woman open it. She was certain that the shock of that moment would haunt her forever. Chapter 12. Husbands, love your wives even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. Ephesians chapter 5 verse 25. Verity arrived early to help her sister Beth get organized for the meeting. Soon after she arrived, the church wagon pulled up with all the wooden benches. Somehow the benches would fit inside the house, it was too cold for the service to be outside. Verity could not relax. She knew that any moment of the day she might come face to face with Reuben. Luckily, she did not see him anywhere until they were seated, and the bishop had already started speaking. As usual, the men were on one side and the women on the other. Reuben sat on the other side, 3 rows to the front of her. She tried not to look over too much, but it was an odd sight, with him sitting in church as if he'd never left. Before long, she realized she was not the only one looking at him. 2 young women sitting in front of her had noticed him. When the girls whispered to each other, Verity was sure they were whispering about Reuben. Verity decided to focus her thoughts on what the bishop said, but then wished she hadn't, as he spoke on bitterness. Bitterness eats away at one's soul. I wonder if I am bitter. The bishop quoted from the Bible, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice." Ephesians chapter 4 verse 31. Yeah, I am harboring bitterness and anger in my heart. I must get rid of it, she thought. As soon as the bishop finished speaking, and the hymns were over, Verity hurried to the kitchen to prepare the simple meal that always followed the gathering. Verity carried some food from the kitchen to the large wooden dining table, which had been moved from the small kitchen into the largest room of the house. As soon as Verity placed the plates on the table, she looked up to see Reuben across the table. He was looking directly at her. Not only was Reuben staring at Verity, she felt all eyes were on her and Reuben. Everyone who was old enough knew what had happened. They knew how Reuben had failed to return to her. Others had told those who weren't old enough to remember by the looks on the faces. Verity felt heat rise to her cheeks. She was sure they were all waiting to see what would happen between Reuben and herself. Wonderful. Not only am I a pitiful spinster, I'm also the subject of idle gossip. Reuben opened his mouth to speak to her, but was interrupted by the 2 single girls who had been sitting in front of Verity through the bishop's talk. Verity walked away. She did not want to hear what they were saying. She knew the girls were around the age when they would be looking for a husband. She stifled her pangs of jealousy. They can have him, she thought. Verity did her best to be inconspicuous, by staying in a corner most of the time until Lily found her. Verity, I've been looking for you. I've been here the whole time. How do you feel having Reuben here? Lily whispered. Verity glanced in Reuben's direction, only to see him speaking to the 2 same girls he was speaking to earlier. Terrible, awful, but there's nothing I can do about it. Lily cleared her throat. He does look good. Lily, don't say things like that. Lily giggled. Why not? It's true. Verity had to admit that he did look good. Verity looked over to the bishop. He was finally alone. Now she would have a chance to speak with him. Bishop John caught her eye. Ah, Verity. I was hoping we might speak. Verity cleared her throat. I was wondering if I might talk to you sometime this week. Come sit over here, we can speak now. Verity had envisioned speaking with the bishop at his home, in private. Now everyone would see the 2 of them speaking. She looked around, and saw that no one was looking at the 2 of them. Yeah, please? You want to talk about Reuben? Verity nodded and swallowed hard. The bishop fixed his hazel eyes on her. I can't tell you what he said to me. No, I don't want to know what he said to you. Verity looked around again, conscious that people would be able to see the 2 of them. Once he looked around at the crowd, the bishop said, Would you feel more comfortable talking at my house tomorrow morning? Verity swallowed on the lump in her throat. Yeah, that would be bitter for me. Oh, I mean better for me. Verity laughed nervously. She had the word bitter in her mind, for that's what she was. She feared her slip of the tongue made her appear foolish. The bishop just smiled at her. Mid-morning? Yeah. Verity turned away and walked back to Lily, who was still in the kitchen. She would feel free to tell the bishop her innermost feelings tomorrow when no one was around. The last time Verity had spoken privately to the bishop was some years ago when she was baptized. Verity decided to make herself busy in the kitchen, and hopefully she would avoid seeing Reuben. On her way back to the safety of the kitchen, she noticed a peculiar sight. Her mother was speaking with Reuben's mother. She knew that the 2 of them were not particularly close friends, so Verity guessed that they were speaking about her and Reuben. Verity's mother glanced up and gave a little smile when she saw Verity. Reuben's mother had her back to Verity and didn't see her. Besides Lily in the kitchen, there were two women who were talking in front of a sink full of dirty dishes. Verity had never been pleased to see work piled up in the kitchen, but today she was. She shooed the two women out of the kitchen and filled up the sink with hot sudsy water. "Help me with the dishes, Lily." Lily's eyes fixed on the huge mound of dishes. "Yeah, all right." She picked up a cloth ready to dry the dishes. "I saw you speaking to the bishop." Verity took a deep breath. Surely it wasn't unusual for someone to speak to the bishop and say hello. In a quiet voice she said, "I'm going to see him tomorrow morning." "Why?" Verity was a little annoyed at her friend. Did she really have to ask why? Wasn't it obvious her life had been turned upside down? "Isn't it obvious what I'm going through? Just to have a talk with him, that's all." "About Reuben." Verity looked around to make sure no one could hear them speak of Reuben. She wanted to scream at her friend. "Of course, Reuben, what other problems do I have in this entire world?" Verity saw the concern on her friend's face. She couldn't be mad at her, even though Verity did want to be mad at someone. "Yeah, about Reuben and the way I'm feeling." To avoid more questions, Verity added, "I'm feeling very angry and upset at Reuben for how he's treated me, and I don't want to become bitter. Like in the bishop's talk today." "That's good, Verity. I'm glad you're going to speak with him," Lily said. Verity smiled, happy that God had blessed her with a good friend in Lily. Chapter 13. Rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation. Continuing instant in prayer. Romans chapter 12 verse 12. Bishop John's house was only a 15-minute buggy ride away from Verity's house. It had been a long time since Verity had driven a buggy anywhere by herself. The buggy horse she used was the family's best buggy horse, a handsome dark bay named Billy. He was one of 3 buggy horses owned by the family. Verity pulled the blanket over her knees while she drove, as the fresh morning chill was still in the air. Mornings were Verity's favorite time of day, and driving in the buggy gave her a profound sense of freedom and peace. She breathed deeply of the fresh air as she passed farms with neat fences, pretty houses and gardens. The bishop's house was a little smaller than the average Amish house, but was very neat. The garden that surrounded the house was well ordered and colorful. The bishop's 9 children were all grown and married, and all but 2 had children of their own. The bishop was a kindly man with a mop of thick black hair with only a few strands of white at his temples. His beard was even thicker than the hair on his head, and was just as dark but with no sign of white. His wife, Sarah, was especially loved by everyone in the community because she was a gentle woman who had nothing but good to say about everything and everybody. Sarah met Verity at the door. "Verity, it's lovely to see you. Come in." "Morning, Sarah. John's waiting for you inside. Would you like coffee or hot tea?" "I'll have some coffee, please." Verity followed Sarah into the house. 2 of Bishop John and Sarah's married children were living with them, along with their spouses, but today they were nowhere to be seen. John sat in the living room with a black Bible on the table in front of him. Verity suddenly felt as if something was eating away at her tummy. All the words she had thought to say had left her head completely. He smiled and said, "Have a seat, Verity." Verity sat down opposite the bishop. "What's on your mind?" Verity took a deep breath and opened her mouth to speak, and hoped that the right words would come out. "It's about Reuben." The bishop nodded, after Verity failed to continue. "This is going to be harder than I thought. I'm upset that he left me, and now he wants to marry me again as if nothing has happened." The bishop just nodded, which made Verity most upset because she wanted him to comment on what she had just said. "He was supposed to come back years ago, and I never got a letter, never any word from him at all. Now he comes back as if nothing has happened." Verity's voice trailed away as she realized she'd repeated herself in her efforts to be understood. "Yeah, I am aware of what happened." Verity needed someone to understand how she felt. She wanted to forget the past and move ahead, but she just couldn't, not after everything she'd been through. "Yeah, the whole community is aware of what's happened. I feel he's made a fool of me. Not only that, but how can I ever trust him again? I can't. In my heart I can't trust him." The bishop leaned back into his wooden chair. Verity, you have become victim to your expectations. You expected him to come back at a certain time, or expected him to contact you when he didn't come back. Is that right? Verity nodded, as she considered that to be a reasonable expectation. He didn't do those things, but now he has come back. Have you read in Luke chapter 15 about the man who had 2 sons? Yeah. Verity remembered the 2 sons. I remember the father was wealthy, and one son went away and lived a worldly life, but then he came back to the father. He said he'd be a servant of his father. The father gave a feast and said he wouldn't accept his son to be a servant because he was his son. Is that right? The bishop picked up his Bible and placed it on his knee. Nothing mattered to the father, but the son had returned. Luke chapter 15 verse 32 says, "It was meet that we should make merry and be glad, for this thy brother was dead and is alive again, and was lost and is found." Our brother in the Lord was dead and now he is alive, he has come back home. Verity was silent for a moment. She pondered what he had said. Was he saying that Reuben would never go away again? I see what you are saying, but how can I get rid of feeling bitterness and anger? The point of the story from Luke was that the father forgave and forgot the son's past, and the son was given the same reward as the son who'd never left and who'd worked hard for him for years. The bishop paused, then continued, "The father forgot the past. Replace the bitterness and anger with feelings of love. Put no expectations on others, only on yourself. If you put no expectations on others, they cannot disappoint you." Verity nodded, and tried to work out how that applied to her situation. She could see that the bishop's words made sense. She had put expectations on Reuben, but wasn't that reasonable to put expectations on someone you were betrothed to? Sarah placed the coffee and some cake in front of them. "Thank you, Sarah. The cake looks lovely. Maybe cake will calm my tummy." "It's orange cake." Sarah walked back to the kitchen, but not before the bishop smiled up at his wife and thanked her. They seemed so happy together, Verity thought. She picked up her hot coffee in both hands and had a small sip. Isn't it reasonable to have expectations if someone has pledged to marry you? Yeah, it is reasonable, but if that person fails you and then says that they are sorry, then it is up to you to forgive that person. Yeah, I can forgive, but do I have to forget? Verity picked up a small piece of orange cake and took a little bite. The bishop balanced his closed Bible on his knees and placed his hands on the arms of his chair. If you keep remembering someone has wronged you, then you haven't truly forgiven them. Verity looked at the sincerity in the bishop's face while soaking in his words. Why is forgiving and forgetting so hard? If you can't do it by yourself, do it with the strength of the Lord. Use His strength within you. The bishop looked into Verity's face. Prayer and faith put into action. There was a moment of silence while both ate a piece of cake. The bishop was the first to speak. Do you love Reuben? Yeah, I've always loved him, but now I'm too scared to trust him in case he runs away again. He was not baptized before, now he is. He is a new man in God. He has put off the old man and become a new man. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 17 says, Therefore if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away, behold, all things are become new. Verity lowered her head. She had been thinking about herself, and hadn't thought very much the impact of Reuben's baptism. Maybe he had become a new man. If he was a new man, maybe he did deserve another chance. All the way back to her house in the buggy, she didn't enjoy the scenery as she was thinking about the bishop's words. A thought occurred to her: if she did take Reuben back, she really had nothing to lose and everything to gain. She did not have Reuben now, so if she took a chance on him and he ran away again, she was only back to where she was right now without him. But if Reuben stayed, she had everything to gain. Maybe he could renovate the B&B, and she could have children with him after all. Could she do this? Could she swallow her pride and forgive the 6 soul-wrenching long years that she had waited for him to return? Should she take the risk of being hurt again? God, please help me do this. Please help me find it in my heart to forgive and forget the pain Reuben has caused me. Please give me joy in my heart once more. Since Verity was alone, she spoke her prayer out aloud. By the time Verity turned the buggy into her driveway, she wanted to run into Reuben's arms and tell him that she would marry him. Today, time was not on her side, as she was due to start work at the restaurant. She would have no time to see him today, because when she finished work it would be too late to go to his parents' house. Even though she would not see Reuben that day, a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. For the first time she had hope. Hope that she would have a family of her own, and hope that Reuben would always be with her. Chapter 14. Now the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, that ye may abound in hope, through the power of the Holy Ghost. Romans chapter 15 verse 13. As she hung up her heavy black coat in the back room of the restaurant, Lily ran toward her. Verity, Shane has asked me out on a date. What should I do? Verity glanced up at the clock and saw that they both didn't have to start work for 10 minutes. Why are you asking me? I'm no expert in the field of love. Lily giggled. He's an Englisher and all, I'm not sure what to do. I like him. Verity loved Lily like a sister, but how could she give her any advice when her own relationship with the man she loved was so wrong in so many ways? I can't really give any advice. It's up to you what you do. Verity knew she didn't have to reinforce the fact to Lily that Shane was an Englisher, as that was clear enough. Aren't there any Amish boys you like? Yeah, there are 2 I like. Lily clutched her hands in front of her chest. Verity had run out of advice for her friend. She could see why she was attracted to Shane. He was a nice man for an Englisher and was very handsome as well. Shane walked through the door of the back room and headed to the cold room, which was behind the girls. He smiled at the 2 of them, and Verity wondered if he guessed that they were talking about him. Verity glanced back at the clock. There was no time to tell Lily of her decision to let Reuben back into her life, as they had to both start work right now. She would have been interested to hear Lily's thoughts on the matter, although she was pretty sure that Lily would be very happy for her. That night, when Verity locked the door of the restaurant, she saw Reuben sitting on an upside-down wooden crate waiting for her. He stayed on the crate while Verity walked slowly toward him. She was pleased to see him, as now she would not have to wait too long to say what she wanted to say to him. Verity, can you ever forgive me for all the horrible things I've done? I'm so sorry. This time Verity was pleased to see him. Yeah, I think I can forgive you. Reuben looked up at her in surprise and rose to his feet. You can? Verity nodded, then said, Yeah, I think so. Reuben stepped closer to her. So you do? Or you just think that you do? Reuben was so close to her that Verity could breathe in his familiar aroma. Reuben King, I forgive you. Reuben spun around in a circle and turned again to face her. You do? Verity laughed. Yeah. That makes me the happiest man in the world, but I'll be even happier the day you agree to marry me. Verity was a little disappointed and let down by his words. Doesn't he realize that I'll marry him right now? I've waited long enough, and I don't want to be the one to do the asking. Verity bit her lip. Words came into her head to speak, so she took a leap of faith and said them out aloud. I will marry you now, Reuben. Reuben stepped in so close to Verity that there was only an inch of space between them. You will? You will marry me? Verity nodded. She was sure she saw tears welling up in his eyes. She fought back her tears. She did not want them both to cry. I will. Reuben put his arms around her waist and pulled her tightly toward him. Verity had all the air crushed from her body and gasped in an effort to breathe. Stop, I can't breathe. I'm sorry, Verity. I'm sorry, I'm just so pleased. I love you so much. I didn't realize how much I loved you or what a fool I'd been until I came back from New York and saw your face. When Verity heard him speak those words, she was sure that he would not leave her again. His words seemed genuine and spoken with his heart. I have to tell you something else, Verity. Verity looked up at him and hoped it wouldn't be another thing that would stand in their way, not after they'd come this far. I have nothing now, Verity. I have no money and nothing to offer you. What do you mean? I thought you made millions. Reuben took a deep breath. I did. I gave it all to my business partner. I signed the company over to him in full. Why, Reuben? It took you years of hard work. I wanted to prove to the bishop that I didn't need all that. The bishop didn't tell me to get rid of all the money. I thought it would be best to let it all go. I want to get my life right with God. That's all that matters now, and you. Reuben clasped both her hands in his. Do you realize how hard it was for me to give up all my money? I made it. I became the success I always wanted to be, but I gave it all up for you and for God. Verity couldn't help but giggle. It was very hard for me to give up my money, Verity. I just want you to know how much you mean to me. Verity stepped in a little closer to him. I think I do now. Reuben squeezed her hands. Let's get married soon, this wedding season. We'll have no time to be published. I think it's too soon. No, it's not. His words were spoken firmly. I want us to be married as soon as possible. If it were up to me, I would marry you right now. If the bishop announces it on the next Sunday, we can have the wedding 3 weeks after that. A silly grin covered Reuben's face. I'll see the bishop about it first thing tomorrow. After we are published, I will personally deliver all the invitations. Verity had waited a long time to get married to Reuben, and now it was all happening so quickly that it sent her head into a spin. Even so, she knew exactly what she wanted for her wedding. With 3 of her sisters already married, she considered herself to be experienced at weddings, and knew exactly how she wanted every detail from the food to the clothing. Reuben released her hands and put an arm around the small of her waist. What are you thinking about? I'm thinking about the wedding and how wonderful it will be. It will be wonderful when the 2 of us are joined by God. Reuben pulled Verity to him tightly. I can hardly believe how my life has turned around in such a short space of time. I was rich but miserable. Then I got a letter that made me think of home. His eyes turned toward the sky. I never found out who wrote that letter. Verity giggled. She wasn't used to being this close to a man. It doesn't matter who wrote the letter. Did you think of me when you thought of home? Reuben stared into her eyes. Of course it made me think about you, and it made me think about how much love and caring is in the community. In the English world, everyone is out for themselves. They don't help each other succeed like the Amish. He was silent for a moment. No one would ever help anyone build their house or help build someone's barn. It's hard for me to know what that's like because I've only known being Amish. Verity had so many questions about life in New York, but now was not the time. Reuben shook his head slightly. It's best you don't know. I wouldn't want anything to change you. It can be hard and cruel sometimes. Were you happy at all? Reuben nodded. Briefly when I got a new car or a business deal went through. But the happiness never lasted. It was happiness over possessions and money, not the happiness over people you love or the love of a family. That's all that's important. Verity desperately wanted to ask him about Brittany, the girl he was engaged to. Surely he had loved Brittany. She did not ask him, in case the answer was not what she wanted to hear. Anyway, I'm going to be his wife now, so what happened in the past does not matter, she thought. I will let the past stay in the past, and I will just be glad he's come back to me. Of course, I will have to ask your dad permission to marry you. Verity's heart sank. Surely her father would say no. He had not been happy with Reuben for leaving the community in the first place, and his unhappiness with Reuben was still evident, even after he had returned to the community. Dad knows how much I've always loved Reuben, so I hope he says yes for my sake. I will speak to your dad tonight. I will also ask him if I can renovate the B&B like we planned before I left. A vision of the dusty tools that lay scattered on the floor of the building flashed through Verity's mind. She was not sure if it was a good idea to mention the B&B. It was a sore point with her father. He hadn't accepted Reuben's check, so he might not accept Reuben having anything to do with the building. Although Reuben had offered him the check when he was an Englisher, now he had returned to the Amish. I hope Dad views things differently now. Verity, the funny thing is, I had everything before I left for New York. I was already rich, but I just didn't know it. They stared into each other's eyes for a few moments more, before Reuben put his soft lips to her forehead and released his arm from around her waist. Reuben and Verity's father were speaking quietly at one end of the living room, while Verity, her mom and Faith were all in the kitchen so that the 2 men could speak privately. They all knew what Reuben had come to speak about. Verity was a little disappointed that she could not hear what they were saying, but from what she could see, they both looked very serious. When the two men had finished talking, they looked pleased with each other and walked into the kitchen. Her father spoke first. "It looks like we are going to have a wedding. If you still want this man, Verity?" Verity's eyes fell to the ground and she felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Yeah, I do, Dad. Reuben already told me you were agreeable to marry him." Verity's father put a hand on Reuben's shoulder and said, "Stay for supper." Verity looked at her sister and her mom, who were both smiling at the good news. "Thank you." Reuben's eyes locked with Verity's in an excited gaze. Verity contained her emotions in front of her parents and sister. She wanted to dance around and holler. She knew by the look Reuben gave her that he wanted to do exactly the same thing as she. While everyone sat at the table, Faith got the supper ready. Verity's father turned to face her. "Reuben tells me he would like to renovate the B&B and go ahead with the original plan of some years ago." "That would be good, Dad." Her father looked to Reuben, then back to Verity. "He wants to make a place for the two of you to live at the back of it before he finishes the rest of it." "That's fine with me. Whatever the two of you decide to do is fine with me." Anything was fine with Verity as long as she had her man back and could be his wife. Chapter 15. And now abide it faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 verse 13. The first thing Verity wanted to do was sew her wedding dress. She chose a blue the same color as the sky, a clear blue. She would copy the same pattern that Ruth used for her prayer cap and cape. Verity sat down with her mom and Faith and made a list of all the food that they would require for the wedding. There was never any way of knowing how many people would attend, so the quantity of food needed was more of an estimate. At all the Amish weddings Verity had been to, there were always vast quantities of food and always a lot left over, even though the weddings could have up to 700 people attending. The list of food included a traditional roast, which was made of shredded chicken mixed with a stuffing of celery, bread and butter, all mixed through with the chicken. There would also be baked ham, all kinds of baked vegetables and coleslaw. For dessert she wanted a lot of different cakes and pies. "I want little cupcakes like I've seen at the bakery, as well as 3 big wedding cakes." The preparations had started days before the wedding. Exactly a week before the wedding the whole family had a working bee, with the 3 married sisters coming back to the house to help give it a good clean from top to bottom. The cooking began 3 days before the wedding. Verity's 2 older sisters helped by baking pies at their own homes, while Ruth came and helped cook back at the house. The day before the wedding, Verity's brother-in-laws and Reuben helped to move all the furniture out of the house, so the benches and long dining tables would fit in, ready for the hundreds of guests who would attend the wedding. For her last night as a single woman, Verity wanted to have her good friend Lily and her sister Faith all sleep in her room. Both girls were to be attendants at the wedding. Verity knew that they would most likely talk and giggle all night, which is exactly what happened. They were mostly giggling about boys, since the wedding the next day would be a good occasion for Faith and Lily to meet a potential husband. Verity woke at daybreak. Lily and Faith were still asleep when Verity trod softly on the wooden floorboards, walking over to the narrow window of her upstairs bedroom. She looked out at the warm golden sun that had just started to raise its head over the damp, dew-filled fields. The day that she thought would never ever come was finally here. Today she would marry Reuben. She still found it hard to believe that all her hopes and wishes had come true. So much had gone wrong for Verity and Reuben in the past that Verity could not ignore the churning in her stomach. She felt as if she were waiting for something else to go wrong for them. She looked at her sky-blue wedding dress that she had carefully made, hanging on the clothes peg. For her attendants, Faith and Lily, she had made soft yellow dresses which complemented their blonde hair that peeped out from under their prayer caps. After Verity had sat on her bed and pondered the wonderful day that lay before her, she woke up the 2 girls. The wagon was due to arrive soon with all the benches and tables. The girls went downstairs, and Verity's grandmother insisted on making them eggs as she said they needed to start the day with a good meal. Verity noticed her mom look slightly annoyed, as grandmother was putting her perfectly ordered kitchen into disarray as she prepared breakfast for the girls. "They don't need breakfast. They'll be eating so much food later." Verity's grandmother just cracked eggs and said, "Nonsense, they can eat now and then later. You don't want Verity fainting at her own wedding, do you?" No, that would be terrible. Verity's mom's voice was exaggerated and hinted of sarcasm, but she knew better than to argue with her mother-in-law, so said no more. After breakfast, the three girls went upstairs to change into their dresses. Verity was sure that if she were any more excited, she might burst. Verity pulled her blue dress over her head and drew her cape over the top of it. She brushed her long hair out, plaited it, and wound it around her head, fastening it with pins before donning her white organza prayer cap. Last of all, she laced up her black high-top boots. She turned and looked at the two girls. There. She spun in a circle. You look lovely, Lily said. Faith nodded. Yeah, you do, Verity. Verity was pleased she could share this day with her sister and her best friend in this special way. How do you like your dresses? Lily smoothed her dress down with both hands. Mine fits nicely and I like the color. I can hear lots of buggies, Faith said as she raced to the window to look out. Oh, there's Reuben arriving. Verity raced to the window to see what Reuben looked like in the clothes she'd made him. He was dressed in a black suit and full white shirt. After several fittings and some minor adjustments, it fitted him perfectly, and Verity considered him to look most handsome in it. What would she say to him when she went downstairs? She wanted to tell him that he looked nice, but that would be a prideful thing to say. When all three girls had finished dressing, they walked downstairs. The room was crowded with people, and Reuben made his way to Verity as she reached the bottom of the stairs. Reuben had a silly grin on his face, and Verity was smiling so much that she was sure her face would start to hurt her soon. They needed no words, the look on their faces said enough. Reuben held Verity's hand and leaned down to whisper in her ear, "Thank you for making me happy and for forgiving me." He squeezed her hand. Forgiving Reuben was one of the hardest things that Verity had ever had to do. She smiled back at him, very glad that she had found the strength through God's grace to forgive. It was already 8:00 o'clock, which meant the service would start shortly. Once the guests were seated, one of the elders gave a talk. He spoke on forgiveness and how married couples need to practice forgiveness and patience. Verity thought that his talk was very fitting to hers and Reuben's circumstances, but of course, everyone in the community knew exactly of their situation. The bishop conducted the ceremony straight after the elders' talk, and pronounced that Verity and Reuben were now husband and wife. Verity could hardly believe what had just happened. The prayers that she had uttered every day for the past 6 years had finally been answered. God had listened to her after all. She was married to the only man she had ever loved. The bishop had given her very good advice, and she was glad she had taken it. Verity and Reuben sat together for the hymns. Mr. Lapp was the main singer, and he started the congregation off in a hymn in High German, while all the ladies who were appointed to serve the meals disappeared into the kitchen. After the 3 other weddings that had been held in the very same house, Verity's mom and grandmother had the routine down to a fine art. When the hymns finished, Reuben and Verity moved to the wedding table, where they enjoyed being waited on first. There were so many people that there had to be 3 sittings for the meal. After the 3rd sitting was over, more hymns were sung. In the weeks following the wedding, every newly married couple is expected to visit people, as Amish custom. Reuben was anxious to get started with his new construction business, so the visiting of people was limited to a few. Until Reuben had a chance to renovate the back ground floor portion of the B&B, they needed somewhere to live, so they had arranged to live with Reuben's parents. Verity still had a feeling that her father was not overly keen on Reuben, and Verity also considered that Reuben's parents had missed so much time with him when he was in New York, that staying with his parents seemed a most logical choice. Verity hoped that they would be able to move to the B&B as soon as they possibly could. 12 months later. What do you think of this color for the walls? Verity pointed to the pale eggshell blue on the paint chart, and hoped her husband Reuben agreed with the color that she wanted to paint the reception room for the B&B. That looks fine. As I said, you're in charge of the decorating. You just tell me what you want me to do. Reuben had already made a good start on his own construction company, and had employed 2 builders. Reuben and Verity were already living in the B&B, in the 1-bedroom and bathroom that Reuben had constructed on the ground floor. Verity picked up the plans for the B&B, which Reuben had asked an architect draw up. In that case, I think that instead of renovating the reception room next, we should renovate this small room next to our bedroom. She pointed to the room on the plans. No, that doesn't make any sense, Verity. We can fully renovate our private area later, but the first priority needs to be getting paying guests in. It makes sense to do everything else first. We've got a bedroom and a bathroom. That's all we need for now. Reuben breathed a heavy sigh. Well, I think we should do this small room before too long. I think we should paint it this color. Verity smiled as she pointed to a soft shade of yellow on a paint card. Verity, I don't think you're listening to me. Reuben ran his hand agitatedly through his hair. The only reason we'd need to do that first is when we... He looked quickly into Verity's eyes. You're not, are you? Tears started to fill Verity's eyes. Yeah, we're having a baby. Reuben let out a yell of delight. You have made me the happiest man in the world. He picked Verity up and swung her around, crushing the architect's plans in between them. Verity laughed. You have to be careful with me now. As he placed her down on the floor, he said, all the money I had couldn't ever buy a moment like this. Couldn't buy you and couldn't buy my life, the life that I have now. He held Verity softly in his strong arms and gently covered his soft warm lips over hers with a tender kiss. Verity thought back to the bishop's words he had spoken to her long ago. He was now a new man. She realized that the joy in her heart must be similar to how God feels when a soul turns back to him. Verity sent a silent prayer of thanks to God for the man in her arms, who had come to know that God and family were more important than all the riches the world has to offer. Thank you for reading Impossible Love. The next book in the Amish wedding season series is Book Number 2, Love at First. Lily's skepticism about love at first sight shatters when she encounters Jason, a captivating Englisher staying at a local B&B. Their unexpected connection challenges Lily's beliefs and stirs her heart in unforeseen ways. But as their romance blossoms, doubts creep in. Is Jason's affection genuine, or does he harbor ulterior motives? Click here for Love at First. For a downloadable printable series reading order of Samantha Price's books, click here or scan below.